In the quiet mud of the North Sea floor, fishermen sometimes drag up mysteries. Trawling nets, meant for cod and plaice, will occasionally snag on something heavy and dark, pulling up the enormous curved tusks of a mammoth or the skull of a woolly rhinoceros. Sometimes they find something even more personal: a sharpened flint tool, a barbed harpoon point carved from deer antler, or even a human jawbone, its teeth still intact after 10,000 years beneath the waves. These are not relics of some ancient shipwreck. They are the last traces of a lost continent, a vast inhabited landscape that once connected Britain to the rest of Europe, a world that is now spoken of in hushed tones as Doggerland. For thousands of years, our ancestors lived and hunted in its rolling hills and marshy river valleys. But as the world grew warmer, the sea began to rise, slowly, inexorably, swallowing their entire world. This is not a myth. It is a geological memory of the last time the Earth fundamentally changed. A change so profound, it would not only redraw the maps, but also completely rewrite the rules for human existence, setting in motion the single greatest revolution in our history. This video is best enjoyed when you're relaxing, during meals, while having coffee before bedtime, or simply unwinding after a long day of work or study. The information has been compiled from various sources. If there's anything inaccurate or in need of correction, please feel free to leave a comment. And feel free to share where you're listening from in the world and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to see how far these stories travel. Now, let us settle in and return to that moment when the world was being reborn in water and warmth. Our story begins not with a person or a discovery, but with the planet itself, taking a long, slow, shuddering breath. For nearly 100,000 years, the Earth had been in the grip of a great ice age, the Pleistocene epoch. It wasn't an unbroken winter, but a long fluctuating period of cold, where colossal sheets of ice, kilometers thick, held much of the world's fresh water hostage. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Weichselian in Eurasia pressed down on the continents, their immense weight depressing the very crust of the Earth. So much water was locked up in this ice that global sea levels were as much as 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, lower than they are today. Coastlines were alien to our modern eyes. Australia was joined to New Guinea. Japan was connected to the Asian mainland, and the Bering Strait was a vast, grassy plain, the land bridge that allowed humans to first walk into the Americas. Life in this world was a grand and dangerous affair. The landscape south of the ice was not a lush forest, but a seemingly endless, windswept steppe and tundra, a kind of prehistoric Serengeti of the north. It was a world of giants, the so-called megafauna. Herds of woolly mammoths, their great tusks curving towards the sky, roamed in vast numbers, their heavy footfalls shaking the frozen ground. Woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, giant Irish elk with bewilderingly large antlers, and saber-toothed cats all shared this starkly beautiful landscape. And living among them, both predator and prey, were our ancestors. For millennia upon millennia, Homo sapiens had perfected a way of life suited to this world. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile family groups, their lives dictated by the seasonal migrations of the great herds. Theirs was a world of stone, bone, and sinew, a life of profound intimacy with the natural world, but also one of constant movement and uncertainty. Then, around 20,000 years ago, something began to shift. The Earth's long, eccentric wobble in its orbit around the Sun, a cycle that plays out over tens of thousands of years, began to subtly increase the amount of solar radiation reaching the northern hemisphere. The planet started to warm up. This was not a smooth, gentle process. It was a chaotic, two steps forward, one step back affair, a long, drawn-out thaw, punctuated by dramatic cold snaps. The most famous of these was a final 1,000-year-long relapse into glacial conditions known as the Younger Dryas, a last gasp of the old ice world. But around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended with shocking abruptness. Ice core samples from Greenland show that regional temperatures may have leapt by as much as 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few decades. The Great Thaw had begun in earnest. This was the dawn of our current geological epoch, the Holocene, the age of entirely recent life. For the people alive at the time, it must have felt like the world was falling apart. The great ice sheets, which had been static, seemingly permanent fixtures of their world, began to melt at a terrifying rate. Rivers swelled into incomprehensible torrents, carving new valleys. Immense glacial lakes, like the vast Lake Agassiz in North America, which was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, would periodically burst through their ice dams, releasing cataclysmic floods that reshaped entire continents in a matter of days. And everywhere, the sea began to rise. Generation after generation, the shoreline crept inwards. Coastal hunting grounds that had sustained a family for centuries became tidal flats, then shallow seas. This wasn't a slow, abstract process. It was a lived reality, a constant state of retreat and displacement, a deep ancestral memory of a world lost to the waves that perhaps echoes in the great flood myths found in so many cultures around the globe. The changing climate also brought a profound ecological transformation. As the ice retreated north, the ecosystems it had supported vanished. The cold, dry mammoth steppe, unable to cope with the warmer, wetter conditions, was replaced by spreading forests. First came the hardy pioneers, birch and aspen, followed by pine. And then, as the soils deepened, great temperate woodlands of oak, elm, and lime spread across Europe and Asia. The megafauna, those titans of the Ice Age, were caught in an evolutionary trap. Their habitat disappeared, and these specialized cold weather giants began a slide into extinction, hastened along by the increasingly sophisticated human hunters. The mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the giant elk, they all vanished, leaving a profound emptiness on the landscape. The hunt had to change. The days of tracking enormous herds across open plains were over. The new forests teemed with life, but it was smaller, faster, and more solitary. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and aurochs. Hunting now required new tools, new strategies, and a more intimate, localized knowledge of a particular stretch of forest or river valley. The world had become smaller, denser, and far more varied. This new world, the world of the early Holocene, presented humanity with a fundamental choice. The old ways were dying. The path of endless wandering was becoming less and more difficult. But the new stable warmth and the lush forested landscapes also offered a new kind of opportunity, a chance to stay put. This critical juncture, born from the melting of a frozen world, is where our story truly begins. This new world, born from the chaotic thaw of the Ice Age, did not change uniformly. In some places, The spreading forests simply meant a change in prey, a shift from mammoth to deer. But in one particular corner of the world, a crescent-shaped sweep of land arcing from Egypt up through the Levant and into Mesopotamia, the change was more profound. This region, which we now call the Fertile Crescent, became a unique ecological mosaic. The warming climate and increased rainfall turned its hills and valleys into a landscape of almost unimaginable abundance, a kind of prehistoric Eden. There were oak and pistachio forests on the hillsides, teeming with wild goats and deer. The rivers were rich with fish and waterfowl, and most importantly, vast, dense stands of wild grasses, the ancestors of wheat and barley, grew like a golden sea under the Middle Eastern sun. It was in this uniquely rich environment that a group of people would embark on a quiet, almost accidental experiment. An experiment that would be the first truly revolutionary step away from the ancient life of wandering. We call them the Natufians. Living between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago, the Natufians are one of history's most important transitional cultures. They were not yet farmers. They planted no seeds and herded no animals. They were still hunter-gatherers, their lives fundamentally tied to the wild resources of the land. But crucially, they were among the very first to stop wandering. The sheer bounty of their environment allowed them to do something that was almost unthinkable for their Paleolithic ancestors: to settle down and live in one place year-round. They are the essential bridge between the old world of the Ice Age nomads and the new world of the Neolithic villagers. Imagine a small Natufian settlement nestled on the shores of a lake in what is now northern Israel, a place like Ain Malaha. This was no temporary cluster of tents. Here, people dug into the soft earth, creating shallow circular pits, which they then lined with stone foundations. Upon these foundations, they built sturdy conical homes of wood, reeds, and hide. These were permanent houses, with central hearths for warmth and cooking, and storage pits for surplus food. For the first time in human history, the concept of home was becoming tied not just to a familiar territory, but to a specific, man-made place. A village of a few hundred people emerged, a community rooted in a single spot, a concentration of human life that was entirely new. This decision to stay put, to invest labor in building a permanent home, represents a profound psychological shift. It implies a trust in the land, a confidence that it would provide for them season after season. This trust was well-founded, and the evidence lies in their toolkit. Natufian archaeological sites are filled with new and highly specialized implements. They created beautifully crafted mortars and pestles, heavy stone bowls, and grinders used to process nuts, and most importantly, to pound the wild cereal grains into a coarse flour. But their most significant invention was the sickle. By taking small, razor-sharp flint blades, known as microliths, and setting them into a handle of carved bone or wood, using natural tar as an adhesive, they created an incredibly efficient tool for harvesting. Archaeologists can identify these sickles by a unique, glossy sheen that develops on the flint blades after repeated use cutting the silica-rich stems of wild grasses. The appearance of these sickles in vast numbers tells a clear story. The Natufians were not just casually gathering a few handfuls of grain. They were systematically harvesting the wild cereals on an almost industrial scale, gathering enough to feed their entire community and, crucially, to store for the leaner months. Their settled lives also allowed for a more complex social and spiritual world to develop. Unlike the scattered and often lost relics of their nomadic predecessors, the Natufians left behind the first true cemeteries. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses or in designated areas within the settlement, often in tightly flexed fetal positions. This practice suggests a powerful connection to place and to ancestry, a desire to keep the spirits of their predecessors close to the living community. Some of these burials are remarkably poignant and elaborate. The deceased were sometimes adorned with intricate headdresses and necklaces made from dentalium shells, small tusk-shaped mollusks that had to be traded from the distant Red Sea or Mediterranean coasts, indicating long-distance social networks. In one famous burial at Ain Malaha, an elderly individual, possibly a woman, was laid to rest with her hand carefully placed on the body of a small puppy. It is one of the oldest and most touching pieces of evidence we have for the emotional bond between humans and dogs, a relationship that was clearly already ancient and deeply meaningful, long before the first sheep or goat was ever herded. Their art, carved into bone and stone, shows a world teeming with the animals they hunted, especially the gazelle, whose graceful forms are a common motif. They carved human figures too, suggesting a rich world of myth and ritual that we can only guess at. But the Natufian experiment, this life of sedentary foraging, carried a hidden vulnerability. Their entire existence depended on the continued, reliable abundance of the wild environment. And right in the middle of their cultural flourishing, the planet threw them a curveball. Remember the Younger Dryas, that 1,000-year cold snap that was the Ice Age's last tantrum? Around 12,800 years ago, it struck the Fertile Crescent hard. Temperatures dropped, rainfall decreased, and the lush landscape grew drier. The vast, reliable stands of wild wheat and barley likely thinned out, and the forests receded. For a people who had given up the mobility of their ancestors and invested everything in a single location, this would have been a catastrophe. The Natufian Eden was faltering. This climate crisis presents us with a fascinating historical mystery. How did they respond? Some archaeologists believe this push was the true trigger for the agricultural revolution. With their primary food source becoming scarcer, the Natufians would have been forced to more actively manage the remaining stands of wild grain. Perhaps they began to clear away competitor weeds. Perhaps they started to intentionally replant seeds in the most favorable locations. These small, desperate acts of intensive management, intended simply to preserve their way of life, may have been the very first unconscious steps on the long road to full-blown agriculture. Their comfortable experiment in settled living had run into a crisis, and the solution they devised, bit by bit, would not just save them from the changing climate. It would end up changing the world forever. While the Natufians in the southern Levant were grappling with a changing climate, perhaps being nudged by necessity toward the first tentative acts of cultivation, a different kind of human energy was gathering just a few hundred miles to the north. On the arid plains of southeastern Anatolia, in what is today modern Turkey, other groups of hunter-gatherers were also responding to the new world of the Holocene. But their response was not focused on subsistence, on the practical problem of finding enough food. Instead, it was an explosion of creativity, social organization, and spiritual expression so unexpected and so monumental that its discovery in the late 20th century sent a shockwave through our entire understanding of the ancient past. They were not building cozy villages to live in. They were building a cathedral on a hill, a place we now call Gobekli Tepe. For decades, the hill, known locally as Potbelly Hill, was assumed to be little more than a medieval cemetery. But when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began to excavate there in 1994, he quickly realized he was uncovering something else entirely. As his teams brushed away the soil, they revealed the tops of immense, immaculately carved limestone pillars arranged in circles. As they dug deeper, the sheer scale of the site became apparent. This was not a graveyard. It was a vast complex of ceremonial enclosures, a ritual landscape built by hunter-gatherers. And the most staggering fact of all was its age. The oldest layers of Gobekli Tepe date back to around 9600 BC, making it some 11,600 years old. This means it is more than 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is, by a vast margin, the oldest known example of monumental architecture in the world, built in a time when we thought humans were living only in small mobile bands. Gobekli Tepe is not a city or a village. There are no houses, no domestic hearths, no signs of permanent habitation. It is purely a sanctuary, a place of gathering and ritual. The site is a collection of at least 20 massive circular or oval enclosures, though only a few have been fully excavated. At the center of these enclosures, and forming their very structure, are the incredible T-shaped megaliths. Quarried from a limestone plateau nearby, these pillars are enormous, some standing nearly 18 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. Transporting these monoliths over a kilometer and raising them into position would have been a staggering feat of engineering, requiring the coordinated effort of hundreds of people with nothing more than ropes, rollers, and sheer muscle power. What makes these pillars so breathtaking is that they are not just structural supports. They are sculptures. They are clearly meant to be stylized representations of powerful human-like beings. Many have arms and hands carved in low relief along their sides, their fingers long and slender, pointing towards their navels. They wear carved loincloths, but they have no faces, their wide T-shaped tops remaining mysteriously blank. They might represent revered ancestors, mythic heroes, or even the first gods, their silent, imposing forms presiding over the rituals that took place within their circles. And these silent watchers are not alone. The surfaces of the pillars are covered with an astonishing menagerie of animal figures, carved with a skill and artistic naturalism that is utterly captivating. But these are not the gentle herbivores that would have made up the bulk of their diet. This is a world of powerful, dangerous, and symbolically charged creatures. Snakes writhe across the stone surfaces, foxes snarl, and wild boars charge with tusks bared. Graceful cranes, vultures with enormous wingspans, and scorpions also feature prominently. This is not a simple record of the local wildlife. It is a window into a complex and vivid spiritual world, a mythology carved in stone. The vulture, in particular, may hold a clue to their beliefs. In many ancient cultures of the region, vultures were associated with death and the sky, believed to carry the flesh of the dead up to the heavens. The prevalence of these birds at Gobekli Tepe suggests that complex rituals surrounding death and excarnation The exposure of bodies to be consumed by scavengers may have been practiced here. The very existence of Gobekli Tepe throws a giant wrench into the traditional story of civilization. For more than a century, the accepted narrative went something like this. First, humanity invented agriculture. This new, reliable food source allowed people to abandon their nomadic ways and settle down in permanent villages. Sedentism, living together in larger groups, led to the development of more complex social structures and religious beliefs, which eventually, over thousands of years, resulted in the construction of temples and cities. Gobekli Tepe seems to flip that entire sequence on its head. Here we have hunter-gatherers, people without pottery, without domesticated animals, and at the very, very dawn of plant cultivation, building one of the most sophisticated structures of the ancient world. This has led to a revolutionary new hypothesis. What if it was the other way around? What if the desire to come together for shared ritual was the primary motivation? Perhaps a powerful new religious ideology emerged, one that was compelling enough to unite disparate bands of hunter-gatherers from across the region. The process of building Gobekli Tepe, a project that would have taken centuries, would have required these groups to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. It would have demanded social organization, leadership, and planning. It also would have created a massive logistical problem. How do you feed the hundreds of workers who are quarrying, hauling, and carving these stones? The sheer demand for food to fuel these communal feasts and construction projects may have been the very thing that spurred the development of agriculture. Perhaps the need to reliably feed the builders of the temple was the catalyst that pushed people to begin cultivating the wild grasses that grew on the hills nearby. In this model, it is not agriculture that creates complex society and religion. It is the communal quest for meaning, the building of the sacred mountain, that creates the need for agriculture. After more than 1,500 years of use, another mystery unfolds. Around $8,000 BC, for reasons we may never understand, the people who used Gobekli Tepe began to deliberately bury it. They filled the magnificent circular enclosures with stone rubble, animal bones, and earth, entombing their sacred creation. It was not violently destroyed or simply abandoned to the elements. It was intentionally and carefully put to rest. This act of burial is as monumental as the act of construction, a final, enigmatic ritual that preserved the site in pristine condition for 10,000 years, waiting for us to find it. Gobekli Tepe is more than just an archaeological site. It is a testament to the fact that the human journey towards civilization was not a simple, linear path driven by practical needs alone. It shows us that our ancestors, long before the first cities or empires, were driven by the same things that drive us: the need for community, the power of belief, and the overwhelming desire to carve our own sense of order and meaning into a vast and mysterious universe. The awe-inspiring circles of Gobekli Tepe show us one path taken by humanity at the dawn of this new age, a path of pilgrimage and monumental faith, a community forged by the construction of a sacred mountain. It was a place for gods, not for people. But at the very same time, in a different corner of the Fertile Crescent, another group was undertaking a communal project just as massive, but with a completely different purpose. Their creation was not a temple to the cosmos, but a fortress for themselves. They were not gathering periodically for ritual, but settling in for the long haul, creating the world's first known town, protected by the world's first known wall. To find it, we must travel back south from the Anatolian highlands, down into the deep, sun-baked rift of the Jordan Valley, to a lush green oasis that has been a magnet for life for millennia, the ancient site of Jericho. Modern Jericho is a vibrant city, but beneath its streets and gardens lies a deep history. The heart of ancient Jericho is a great mound, or tell, called Tel es Sultan. A tell is a man-made hill, built up over thousands of years as generations of people built their homes, lived their lives, and abandoned their dwellings, one layer on top of another, creating a rich archaeological layer cake. And the bottommost layers of this mound tell a story that begins at the very end of the Ice Age. The site's magic comes from a single, powerful spring, Ain as Sultan, which gushes with fresh water to this day, creating a patch of impossible green in the surrounding desert. It was this reliable water source that first attracted a small band of Natufian hunters, the same culture we met earlier, who established a small shrine and camp here around 10,000 BC. But around 9500 BC, right as the Holocene was getting underway, this small seasonal camp underwent a startling transformation. It exploded into a sprawling permanent settlement, a true town covering nearly 10 acres. This was the first phase of Neolithic Jericho, a period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic Age, or PPNA. The people here built densely packed circular houses from mud bricks they had shaped and dried in the sun. These dwellings were often semi-subterranean, their floors sunk below ground level for coolness, and topped with a domed roof of branches and mud. To walk through PPNA Jericho would have been to navigate a maze of these round, hive-like structures, a bustling community of perhaps as many as 2,000 people, an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity for this deep past. These were some of the world's earliest farmers. Taking advantage of the life-giving spring, they cultivated fields of emmer wheat and barley. Yet they had not fully abandoned the old ways. The bones found in their rubbish pits show that they still relied heavily on hunting, especially gazelles, which they pursued in the hills beyond their settlement. They were a people with one foot in the new world of agriculture, and one still firmly planted in the ancient world of the hunt. This combination of reliable farmed grains and hunted meat, all centered around an inexhaustible spring, meant that Jericho was accumulating something unprecedented, a permanent, storable surplus of wealth. And this wealth, it seems, needed protecting. It is for this reason that the people of PPNA Jericho embarked on one of the most astonishing construction projects of the ancient world. They encircled their entire town with a massive stone wall. It was more than 6 feet thick and perhaps as much as 12 feet high, a formidable barrier against the outside world. Just inside this wall, they built something even more incredible, a solid stone tower, nearly 30 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter at its base. A steep, narrow internal staircase of 22 stone steps, each one polished by the passage of ancient feet, leads to the summit. It is an extraordinary piece of engineering, the first large-scale stone building in human history. Archaeologists have estimated that its construction would have taken more than 10,000 days of human labor. The existence of this wall and tower has long fueled a great debate, a central mystery about the dawn of settled life. Why, after hundreds of thousands of years of living in open, unfortified camps, did humans suddenly feel the need to build such massive defenses? The most straightforward answer has always been warfare. The wall, in this view, was built to protect the town's precious water supply and its stores of grain from other, less fortunate groups, perhaps nomadic hunters or rival early farming communities. It suggests that with the accumulation of property and the rise of settled life came a dark companion, organized violence. The tower would have been a lookout post, a place for sentinels to watch for approaching enemies across the plains. This theory paints a grim picture of the Neolithic dawn, where the first town was born out of fear, and defensible walls became a necessity. However, more recent theories offer a different interpretation. Some archaeologists have pointed out that Jericho lies at the foot of a wadi, a channel that is dry for most of the year, but can become a raging torrent during seasonal flash floods. They propose that the wall was not a military defense at all, but a sophisticated flood control system designed to protect the mud brick town from being washed away. The tower, in this scenario, would have been a central, reinforced part of this levy. This theory reframes the monumental effort not as a response to human conflict, but as a grand communal project to tame and control the forces of nature, a symbol of humanity's growing power to reshape its environment. A third possibility is that the tower's purpose was not purely practical at all. Archaeologists have noted that on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the setting sun sinks behind a nearby mountain, and its shadow falls directly onto the tower, which then casts its own shadow across the entire settlement. Perhaps the tower was a ritual structure, a sacred calendar of stone that marked the turning of the seasons, so crucial for a farming community. It could also have been a symbol of a new kind of social power, the ability to organize the labor to build such a structure might have been the tool of an emerging elite, a way to solidify their authority and forge a collective identity for the town's inhabitants. The tower loomed over every home, a constant physical reminder of the community's power and the leadership that directed it. Was it built to stop an army, to stop a flood, or to track the sun? Perhaps it was all three. Whatever its primary purpose, the wall and tower of Jericho stand as a stark monument to a new chapter in the human story. While the people of Gobekli Tepe were uniting to build a home for their gods, the people of Jericho were uniting to build a fortress for themselves. Both were revolutionary acts of social cohesion, but they point to the two great, often conflicting forces that would shape all future civilizations, the sacred and the secular, the power of faith and the power of the wall. The great stone tower of Jericho, casting its long shadow at sunset, was a monument to a new kind of human society, a community large enough, organized enough, and wealthy enough to undertake such a colossal project. But the stones and mud bricks of Jericho, and even the sacred pillars of Gobekli Tepe, all rested on a new and living foundation. This foundation was not stone, but something far more humble, yet infinitely more powerful: the cultivated grains of wheat and barley. For Jericho to exist, for humanity to take this decisive step towards settled life, it first had to forge an entirely new relationship with the plant kingdom. This was not a sudden invention, not a single moment of genius. It was a slow, subtle, and largely accidental dance of coevolution between humans and grasses, a process that unfolded over centuries and would, in the end, entangle our destinies forever. To understand this quiet revolution, we have to go back to the hillsides of the Fertile Crescent, back to the wild ancestors of our first crops. Before any human hand had planted a seed, vast natural meadows of wild acorn, wild emmer wheat, and wild barley would ripen each year under the sun. For the hunter-gatherers, like the Natufians, these were a miraculous seasonal bounty, but harvesting them was a frustrating and inefficient affair. Wild cereals have a built-in survival mechanism that is a harvester's nightmare. Their central stem, the part that holds the precious kernels, is known as the rachis, and in the wild, this rachis is brittle. When the grain is ripe, the rachis is designed to shatter at the slightest disturbance, a gust of wind, a passing animal, so that the seeds scatter far and wide to propagate the next generation. For a person trying to gather these grains with a primitive sickle, this meant that most of the kernels would fall to the ground, lost, before the stalk could even be cut and brought back to the settlement. However, in any large population of wild grasses, a few oddities will appear due to random genetic mutation. Every so often, a plant would be born with a genetic defect, a tough rachis. For the plant, this mutation was a reproductive dead end. Its seeds would remain stubbornly attached to the stalk, unable to scatter and germinate. In the wild, this gene would quickly die out, a failed experiment of nature. But for a human harvester, this genetic flaw was a jackpot. A plant with a tough rachis would hold onto its seeds, allowing the harvester to cut the entire seed head intact and place it in their basket. Here, in this simple interaction, lies the key to the entire process of domestication. Imagine an early Neolithic woman walking through a field of wild barley with her bone-handled sickle. As she swings the blade, the stalks with the normal brittle rachis shatter, and their seeds fall to the earth. The few mutant stalks with the tough rachis, however, do not. Their seed heads are harvested whole. As a result, the grain she brings back to her village contains a disproportionately high percentage of seeds from these tough rachis mutants. Back at the settlement, as she processes the grain, some of it inevitably spills. Perhaps some is intentionally planted in a small cleared patch of ground near her home, an experimental garden watered by the local spring. The seeds that sprout in this new human-tended plot will now carry a much higher frequency of the tough rachis gene. The next year, when this small field is harvested, the process repeats. Once again, the tough rachis plants will be the most successfully harvested, and their seeds will form the bulk of the grain that is both eaten and used for the following year's planting. Year after year, generation after generation, humans were unconsciously selecting for this trait. Without any formal knowledge of genetics, they were actively breeding a new kind of plant, one that was becoming increasingly dependent on them for its own survival. This process, known as unconscious selection, was the slow, patient engine of the agricultural revolution. Over thousands of generations of this intimate partnership, other changes began to appear. The plants, now protected in human-tended fields from their natural competitors, began to channel their energy differently. The individual kernels grew larger and plumper. The tough outer husk, or gloom, became thinner, making the grains easier to thresh and mill. The plants even developed a more uniform ripening time, a trait incredibly convenient for a community that needed to harvest its entire crop in a single, intense burst of activity. In essence, these plants were shedding their wild survival traits in exchange for traits that were useful to the humans who had become their caretakers. This new relationship, however, was a demanding one. The dream of farming as a life of ease is a modern fantasy. It was, in reality, an exchange of the uncertainties of the hunt for a life of relentless, back-breaking labor. Fields had to be cleared of stones and trees, a task made possible by the development of new polished stone axes. The soil had to be broken and tilled with simple, fire-hardened digging sticks. The seeds had to be planted by hand. All season long, the growing crops had to be weeded and protected from birds, insects, and hungry wild animals. Then came the harvest, a frantic period of cutting the stalks from dawn until dusk with a small hand-held sickle. And the work was still not done. The harvested grain had to be threshed by beating it on a hard-packed floor to separate the kernels from the stalk. Then it was winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grains behind. And finally, every single day, the hard, dry kernels had to be ground by hand into flour, a grueling task performed by women, kneeling for hours over a saddle-shaped stone called a quern, rocking a smaller stone back and forth to produce enough flour for the family's daily bread. This was the new rhythm of life, a cycle of intense seasonal labor that would have been utterly alien to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The plants and the people had become locked in a symbiotic embrace. The domesticated wheat and barley could no longer survive in the wild. They depended entirely on humans to sow their seeds. And the humans, with their growing populations anchored to a single place, were becoming just as dependent on their harvest. The failure of a crop could mean starvation for an entire village. The fate of this single humble grass had become the fate of humanity. The slow, patient work of transforming wild grasses into domestic grains was the engine of the Neolithic Revolution, a quiet miracle of unconscious selection that made the first towns possible. But this profound entanglement with the plant world was only half of the story. As humans were tethering themselves to plots of land, they were also forging a new and equally revolutionary partnership with the animal kingdom. No longer would they be simply hunters, stalking their prey in a world of equals. They were becoming shepherds and herders, actively shaping the evolution of other species, creating a living, breathing, walking larder of food and resources that would fundamentally alter their relationship with nature itself. This story begins, however, long before the first fields were ever sown, with an alliance forged in the firelight of Ice Age hunting camps. The first animal to cross the threshold from wild to domestic was not a docile herbivore, but a powerful predator, the wolf. Every single dog on Earth today, from the tiniest chihuahua to the most massive mastiff, is a descendant of the formidable grey wolf. The process of its domestication is a fascinating mystery, and unlike the animals that would follow, it likely began not with human intention, but with the animal's own initiative. The old story of brave hunters capturing wolf pups and raising them as pets is probably only a small part of the truth. A more likely scenario is one of self-domestication. Around the periphery of human camps, with their enticing smells of roasting meat and discarded bones, a new ecological niche opened up. For the wolf packs, most individuals were too wary to approach the dangerous two-legged apes and their fires. But within any wolf population, there is natural variation in temperament. Some wolves are bolder, less fearful, more curious. These individuals would have been the first to venture close, to scavenge the refuse left by the human hunters. Over countless generations, the wolves that were least aggressive and most tolerant of human proximity would have been the most successful in this niche, raising more offspring that shared these traits. Humans, in turn, would have quickly recognized the value of these resident wolves. They were a superb early warning system, barking at the approach of strangers or more dangerous predators like cave bears. They helped keep the camp clean of scraps, and their superior senses of smell and hearing would have made them invaluable partners on the hunt. A bond of mutual benefit was formed, one that deepened over millennia until the wolf had become the dog. By the time the Natufians were building their first settled homes, as we saw in the burial of the woman and her puppy, this ancient alliance was already cemented in deep affection. The dog was humanity's oldest friend, ready to stand by our side as we embarked on our next great project. That project was the domestication of livestock. While dogs were partners, the next wave of animals, goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs, were brought into the human world primarily as a resource. They were the living, breathing complement to the fields of grain, providing a steady, reliable source of meat, milk, fat, hides for clothing, and bone for tools. The process likely began in the Zagros and Taurus Mountains, the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, around 11,000 years ago. The pioneers of this new economy were the goat and the sheep. Their wild ancestors, the Bezoar ibex and the Asiatic mouflon, were hardy, nimble creatures of the mountains. They possessed several key traits that made them ideal candidates for domestication. They were herd animals with a clear social hierarchy, meaning humans could effectively hijack this instinct and insert themselves as the dominant leader of the flock. They were not territorial, they were not overly aggressive, and crucially, their diet of coarse grasses and shrubs did not compete with human food sources. The process was likely a gradual one. It probably began as a more controlled form of hunting, where people would follow and manage a specific wild herd, protecting it from other predators and culling only certain animals, ensuring the herd's survival. Over time, this management became ownership. The most docile animals, the ones that were easiest to control, would have been kept, while the more aggressive or flighty ones were culled. This was selective breeding in its infancy. Slowly, this new relationship began to leave its mark on the animals themselves. Their bodies changed. Domesticated sheep, for instance, were bred to lose their coarse outer guard hairs and enhance their soft, woolly undercoat, the foundation of all textile production. Their horns changed shape, shrinking or disappearing entirely. Even their brains became smaller than their wild cousins. They were becoming neater, safer, more productive, and more dependent on their human protectors. They were, in essence, living artifacts shaped by human needs. If domesticating sheep and goats was a feat of patience, domesticating cattle and pigs was a testament to human courage. The ancestor of all domestic cattle was the aurochs, a truly formidable beast. Standing over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with massive horns and an aggressive temperament, the aurochs was one of the most dangerous animals in the post-Ice Age world. Taming this creature and bringing it into the human fold was a monumental achievement. But the rewards were immense. A single cow offered a huge amount of meat and hide, and its milk would become a vital source of nutrition. Later, its immense strength would be harnessed to pull the first plows, truly revolutionizing agriculture. The wild boar, ancestor of the domestic pig, was similarly aggressive and dangerous, but its omnivorous diet and rapid breeding cycle made it an incredibly efficient addition to a farming village, a living recycling unit that could convert household scraps and forest forage into valuable meat and fat. This domestication of livestock marked a fundamental shift in the human worldview. We were no longer simply one species among many, subject to the whims of nature. We were now actively managing and reshaping the lives and the very genetic makeup of other creatures. It was an awesome responsibility, requiring a new set of skills: veterinary care, finding adequate pasture and water, protecting the herd from wolves and lions, and managing the complex logistics of a pastoral life. It gave humanity a new sense of security and control, a buffer against the uncertainties of the hunt and the harvest. The farmer's field and the shepherd's flock were the twin pillars of the new Neolithic world, a powerful and resilient system for survival that was now complete. This Neolithic package of domesticated plants and animals was a portable revolution, ready to be carried out of its cradle in the Fertile Crescent, destined to transform landscapes and societies across the globe. With the powerful new toolkit of domesticated plants and animals, the complete Neolithic package, humanity had unlocked a source of energy and security unlike anything it had ever known before. The wandering life of the hunter-gatherer was giving way to the rooted, cyclical life of the farmer and the herder. This new stability allowed for something that had previously been impossible: the growth of truly large, dense, and permanent communities. If Jericho was a fortified town, a bold first step in this direction, then our next destination, a sprawling settlement on the fertile plains of southern Anatolia, was something else entirely. It was a proto-city, a megacity of its time, a human hive so large, so strange in its design, and so artistically vibrant that it represents one of the most brilliant and complex social experiments of the entire Neolithic Age. This was Catalhoyuk, flourishing for nearly 2,000 years, from roughly 7,500 BC to 5,700 BC. Catalhoyuk was a city before the concept of a city truly existed. At its peak, this great mound of human habitation covered more than 30 acres and was home to an estimated 8,000 people. This was a population density that would not be seen again in the region for thousands of years. But what makes Catalhoyuk so utterly captivating is not just its size, but its architecture. It was a city with no streets. It had no lanes, no alleys, no courtyards, and no ground floor doors. The entire settlement was a single, monolithic block of mud brick houses, packed together side by side like the cells of a honeycomb, their walls abutting one another. The only way to navigate this human labyrinth was to walk across the city's flat rooftops. Life in Catalhoyuk was lived on and between these roofs. They formed a vast, interconnected system of public plazas and thoroughfares. It was here that people would have worked, socialized, and moved from one part of the city to another. To enter your own home, you would climb down a sturdy wooden ladder through a square opening in the ceiling. This unique design made the city a natural fortress. With no doors or windows at ground level, the sheer continuous outer wall of the outermost houses presented a formidable defensive barrier. Any potential attacker would have to scale that wall only to find themselves in a bewildering maze of rooftops with the city's inhabitants emerging from their hatches like hornets from a nest. It was a city that looked inward, its design fostering a powerful sense of communal identity and separation from the wild world outside. Inside these houses, archaeologists have found a world of remarkable complexity and artistic expression. The homes, though individually owned and built, followed a surprisingly standard plan. Each consisted of a large main room, typically with one or two smaller side chambers used for storage. The main room was the center of family life, with raised platforms built along the walls for sitting, working, and sleeping. A hearth and a domed oven were always situated against the south wall, directly beneath the roof opening, allowing smoke to escape. The interiors were kept meticulously clean. The floors were covered with woven reed mats, and the walls were coated in a smooth, white plaster that was frequently renewed. But these were not just simple living spaces. They were shrines. A huge number of the houses excavated were lavishly decorated with vibrant murals and sculptures. The plastered walls were their canvases, painted with scenes of daily life and strange, powerful rituals. There are dynamic hunting scenes, showing groups of energetic, dancing figures teasing and baiting enormous wild bulls and stags. There are geometric patterns, intricate designs that resemble the woven patterns of the kilim rugs for which the region is still famous. And there are more unsettling images. Giant vultures with human legs swooping down upon headless human bodies. They also molded incredible sculptures directly onto the walls. The most common and most powerful of these are the Bucrania, the skulls of enormous wild aurochs, their horns still attached, which were plastered into the walls of the homes, often presiding over the sleeping platforms like guardian spirits. This intense focus on ritual life within the home is part of the great mystery of Catalhoyuk. Despite its enormous size and dense population, archaeologists have found no evidence of any central, public, or administrative buildings. There is no great temple like at Gobekli Tepe. There is no palace for a king, no central granary, no marketplace. All the houses are roughly the same size, built with the same materials, and none seems conspicuously wealthier than any other. Even their burial customs suggest a remarkably egalitarian society. The people of Catalhoyuk buried their dead not in a separate cemetery, but directly beneath the floors of their own houses. The bodies of their ancestors literally formed the foundations of their homes, a powerful and constant presence in the lives of the living. But these burials show little evidence of social hierarchy. There are no royal tombs filled with treasure. A person's status, it seems, was not defined by their material wealth. How then did a city of 8,000 people function without a clear government, without kings, priests, or a ruling elite? This is the central question that Catalhoyuk poses. The current thinking is that it was a society organized around deeply held and widely shared customs and beliefs. Social order was maintained not by a top-down authority, but by a powerful set of community traditions and rituals, all centered on the individual household. The famous female figurines found at the site, often depicted as heavy-set women giving birth or seated on thrones flanked by leopards, were once thought to be evidence of a single, dominant mother goddess religion. But the sheer variety of the art, with its emphasis on dangerous wild animals, especially the powerful bull, and its representations of both male and gender-neutral figures suggests a more complex belief system, one that celebrated the tangled connections between humanity, the animal world, and the cycle of life, death, and ancestry. Catalhoyuk shows us that the path from the first farming villages to the great cities of the ancient world was not a single inevitable line. It was a period of incredible social experimentation, and this strange and beautiful city of rooftops was one of its most successful and enigmatic creations. Within the mud brick walls of Catalhoyuk, with their elaborate murals and sacred bulls' heads, life was becoming ever more complex. The people of this great settlement were masters of clay in its raw, sun-dried form. They built their homes from it, shaped their ovens with it, and plastered their walls in it, creating a smooth, white canvas for their art. But for the first few thousand years of the agricultural revolution, a critical technology was missing from their toolkit. The people of the pre-pottery Neolithic, from Jericho to the first Anatolian villages, had no ceramic pots. They lived in a world without the simple, profound convenience of a fired clay vessel. The adoption of this new technology, the invention of pottery, would mark a new phase in our story, a revolution for the kitchen and the storehouse that would change the texture of daily life forever. It is difficult for us to imagine a world without pottery. How did these first farmers cook their food? How did they store their precious water and surplus grain? They had to rely on a range of less durable or more labor-intensive containers. They wove intricate watertight baskets, which they could use for cooking by dropping fire-heated stones directly into the water within, a slow and cumbersome process we call stone boiling. They used bags made from animal skins and stomachs, gourds hollowed out and dried, and bowls painstakingly carved from soft stone like limestone. For storing grain, they dug pits into the floors of their homes, lining them with plaster. These methods worked, but they all had their drawbacks. Baskets and leather are perishable. Stone bowls are incredibly heavy and can shatter, and storage pits are vulnerable to moisture, mold, and hungry pests like mice. The transformation of soft, pliable clay into hard, waterproof ceramic is a kind of everyday magic. One of the first times humans deliberately initiated a chemical change to create an entirely new material. The process, developed with patient trial and error, begins with finding the right kind of clay, often from a riverbank. This clay is then cleaned of impurities and mixed with a tempering agent, sand, grit, crushed shell, or chopped straw, which adds strength and prevents the pot from cracking during the firing process. The potter then shapes the vessel, not on a potter's wheel, which was a much later invention, but by hand, patiently pinching it into shape or building it up with long coils of clay, smoothing the walls as they went. Once shaped, the greenware pot must be left to dry completely. Then comes the final fiery transformation. The dried pot is placed in a simple bonfire or a shallow pit covered with fuel and heated to a temperature of at least 600 degrees Celsius, about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the molecular structure of the clay is permanently altered. Water molecules are driven out, and the clay particles fuse together, or sinter, into a new, stone-like substance. A material that was once fragile and would dissolve in water becomes hard, durable, and waterproof. It was an act of applied chemistry, a technology that, once perfected, would spread like wildfire. Interestingly, while the Neolithic farmers of the Near East were late adopters, pottery itself is much older. The world's oldest known ceramic vessels were made by Ice Age hunter-gatherers in East Asia as far back as 20,000 years ago. For these communities, like the Jomon people of Japan, who lived in resource-rich coastal areas, pottery was a useful tool for stewing fish, shellfish, and nuts. For the highly mobile big game hunters of the Paleolithic, however, heavy and fragile pots were an impractical luxury. It was only when people settled down and began producing a significant agricultural surplus that the true potential of pottery was unlocked in the Fertile Crescent, around 7000 BC. The impact of this new technology was profound. First and foremost, it revolutionized cooking. For the first time, people could boil, stew, and simmer their food directly and efficiently over a fire. This opened up a whole new culinary world. The hard kernels of wheat and barley could now be easily turned into soft porridges, gruels, and soups. This was not just a matter of taste. It was a nutritional breakthrough. Boiling unlocks nutrients, breaks down toxins in certain plants, and creates soft, easily digestible food. This would have been a huge benefit for weaning infants, the elderly, and those with dental problems, potentially leading to better health and higher survival rates. Pottery also transformed storage. A large ceramic jar with a lid was the perfect vessel for keeping surplus grain dry and safe from mice and insects. Water, olive oil, and wine could be stored and transported without leakage. The ability to process milk from their domesticated goats and sheep into longer-lasting products like cheese and yogurt also depended on having clean, durable ceramic containers. Pottery was the technology of food security, the essential hardware for managing the agricultural software. But pots were never just about function. From the very beginning, they were also a canvas for human expression. As soon as people mastered the basic technique, they began to decorate their creations. They incised patterns into the wet clay with sharp tools, or painted them with slips of colored clay before firing. Archaeologists can trace the spread of ideas and people by following the distinct styles of pottery these cultures produced. The beautiful, intricate geometric designs of the Halafian ware in northern Mesopotamia, or the stylized animal motifs of the Samaran culture to its south, are the distinct artistic signatures of these long-vanished peoples, a silent language spoken in baked earth. This leaves us with a curious question. If pottery was so useful, why did the first farmers of the Near East wait 3,000 years to adopt it? One compelling theory suggests they already had a sophisticated container technology of their own. Archaeologists have found that many pre-pottery Neolithic sites contain fragments of something called white ware or vaisselle blanche. These were vessels made not from clay, but from limestone plaster, which was molded around a basket and then allowed to set. This technology, while effective, was very fuel-intensive, as it required burning limestone at high temperatures. It's possible that this established tradition of plasterware met their needs for a time, delaying the switch to ceramics. But eventually, the sheer abundance of clay and the superior durability and versatility of fired pottery won out, and the age of the ceramic pot began in earnest, changing the Neolithic world one meal at a time. The simple, revolutionary magic of the fired clay pot provided the final essential piece of the Neolithic toolkit. With domesticated grains, herded animals, and now durable ceramic vessels for cooking and storage. The new agricultural way of life was complete. It was a robust and self-sustaining system, one that allowed for larger populations and a greater degree of food security than ever before. This powerful Neolithic package was so successful that it could not be contained within its fertile crescent cradle. Like a slow but unstoppable tide, it began to spread, carried by a new kind of pioneer. Our story now moves from its Near Eastern heartland and follows the footsteps of these first farmers as they begin one of the most consequential migrations in human history, the journey into the wild, dense, primeval forests of ancient Europe. For many years, the question of how farming came to Europe was a great archaeological debate. Did the local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the descendants of the Ice Age artists who painted the caves at Lascaux and Altamira, simply hear about this new way of life from their neighbors to the southeast and decide to adopt it? Was it a peaceful spread of ideas, of seeds and techniques from one group to another? Or was it a spread of people, a great wave of migration, as farmers from Anatolia and the Near East physically moved into the continent, bringing their crops, their animals, and their entire way of life with them, displacing or absorbing the native hunting populations? Today, thanks to the revolutionary science of ancient DNA, we have a much clearer answer. The genetic evidence is overwhelming. The arrival of the Neolithic in Europe was propelled by a massive migration of people. The genomes of these first European farmers show a clear and direct ancestry, tracing back to the early agricultural populations of Anatolia. Of course, the process was complex. There was interaction, trade, and interbreeding with the local hunter-gatherers along the way. But the fundamental story is one of colonization, a slow and steady demographic wave that would take several thousand years to wash over the entire continent, forever changing its genetic and cultural landscape. The vanguard of this great wave, the first culture to bring the full Neolithic package into the heart of Central Europe, is known to us by a wonderfully specific and descriptive German name, the linear band ceramic culture, or LBK for short. The name means linear band ceramic, and it comes from their highly distinctive pottery, the very technology we explored in our last chapter. LBK pots were typically simple, globular bowls made from fine clay, but they were decorated with a remarkably consistent and elegant style of incised lines, spirals, and meandering bands that are instantly recognizable to any archaeologist, whether the pot is found in Hungary or in France. Beginning around 5500 BC, the LBK people spread from the area of modern-day Hungary and Austria with astonishing speed. They moved west across Germany and north into Poland, eventually reaching the Paris Basin. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were incredibly selective about where they chose to live. They sought out one specific type of environment, the rich, fertile, and easily worked loess soil that is found in the great river valleys of Europe, like the Danube, the Rhine, and the Elbe. They completely ignored the hills, the heavier clay soils, and the sandy plains, leapfrogging from one perfect patch of loess to another. This left the surviving native Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to continue their traditional way of life in the landscapes the farmers did not want, creating a Europe of two coexisting but very different worlds. Where the LBK settled, they transformed the landscape. They were Europe's first true lumberjacks. With their polished stone adzes, known as shoelast Celts, for their distinctive shape. They cleared patches of the dense, ancient forest that had covered Europe since the end of the Ice Age. In these clearings, they planted their Near Eastern crops, emmer and einkorn, wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. And they grazed their Near Eastern animals, cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs, in the surrounding woodland pastures. At the heart of these clearings, they built their iconic homes, the LBK Longhouse. These were colossal structures, unlike anything Europe had seen before. Built from massive timber frames using split oak posts, these rectangular buildings could be up to 45 meters or 150 feet in length. They were architectural marvels designed to last for a generation. Under one long, sloping, thatched roof, a whole extended family or clan would live, with dedicated sections for sleeping, for working, and for sheltering their precious livestock during the harsh European winters. The attics, meanwhile, would have been used as vast granaries to store the harvest that would see them through to the next year. These great long houses, clustered together in small villages, were the foundational unit of this new European society. For a long time, the story of the LBK was told as a peaceful one, the heroic tale of pioneer farmers taming a virgin wilderness. But in recent decades, a much darker chapter of their history has been unearthed. At several sites, particularly from the later period of the LBK culture, archaeologists have found chilling evidence of organized, brutal violence. At a place called Thalheim in Germany, a mass grave was discovered containing the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, and adults. They had not been ceremonially buried. Their bodies had been tossed into a pit. Forensic analysis showed that they had all died violently, their skulls smashed with the distinctive stone adzes of their own culture, and some had been shot in the back with arrows as they tried to flee. A similar, even larger massacre site was found at Aspernschletz in Austria, where the remains of nearly 70 individuals were found within a defensive ditch. What caused this sudden explosion of violence at the end of the LBK period? This is a grim and troubling mystery. Was it the result of growing population pressure? After several centuries of expansion, perhaps all the prime Loess soil had been claimed, and competition for land between different LBK villages erupted into endemic warfare. Or was it a sign of a profound internal social crisis, a breakdown of the cooperative norms that had held their society together for so long? The genetic evidence from Thalheim suggests the attackers were not strangers. They were other LBK people closely related to their victims. This was not a war against outsiders, but a brutal conflict from within. The story of Europe's first farmers, it turns out, was not just one of peaceful toil and pioneer spirit. It was a complex human drama of migration, settlement, and ultimately, a wave of terrible violence that brought their unique culture to a sudden and brutal end, paving the way for the new societies that would rise from their ashes. The story of the linear band ceramic culture, with its great timber longhouses and its eventual violent collapse, is the story of the Neolithic's arrival in the most fertile, easily farmed corridors of Central Europe. But the continent was not a uniform landscape of gentle river valleys. Beyond the Loess plains lay rugged hills, dense wetlands, and the towering, dramatic peaks of the Alps. While the LBK were colonizing the prime real estate, other groups of Neolithic pioneers were devising ingenious new ways to adapt the agricultural lifestyle to these more challenging environments. To find them we turn our gaze south to the crystal-clear lakes nestled at the foot of the Alps, where a remarkable and long-lasting new tradition would emerge, the world of the Neolithic lake dwellers. For thousands of years, from the Neolithic right through to the end of the Bronze Age, communities across modern-day Switzerland, southern Germany, Austria, and northern Italy chose to build their homes in a very peculiar and challenging location, right on the water's edge. The 19th century discovery of these sites sparked a romantic vision of picturesque villages built on stilts far out over the open water, a kind of prehistoric Venice. Modern archaeology, however, has given us a more accurate and in many ways more interesting picture. These were not villages built over the lake, but rather on its marshy, unstable shoreline. The thousands of wooden piles, or stilts, that defined these settlements were not for raising houses high above deep water, but for a far more practical purpose: to create a solid, dry, and stable foundation in the soft, waterlogged mud of the boggy lakeshore. Building one of these pile-dwelling villages was a monumental undertaking. A community would have to fell hundreds, sometimes thousands, of mature oak, ash, or alder trees from the surrounding forests. They would sharpen these great timbers into posts and, with immense communal effort, drive them deep into the shoreline mud. Upon this dense forest of piles, they would construct a wooden platform, and on that platform, they would build their homes, modest, rectangular houses of timber framing, or wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs. These villages were often connected by wooden trackways and walkways, and frequently protected by a formidable defensive palisade of sharpened stakes facing the landward side. Life on the edge of the water was a constant battle against the elements, requiring immense labor to maintain. So why did they choose it? The mystery of why these people chose such a difficult building environment has long been debated. The answer is likely a combination of factors. The lake provided an excellent natural defense, a moat that protected the village from predators and human enemies. It also offered a wealth of resources, an inexhaustible supply of fish, waterfowl to hunt in the reeds, and a convenient waterway for transportation by dugout canoe. But the most significant consequence of their choice of home, at least for us, is an archaeological miracle. The cold, oxygen-free mud of these lakeside locations has preserved organic materials that would have rotted away and vanished at almost any other type of site. The lake dwellings are a treasure trove, a high-resolution snapshot of daily Neolithic life that is unparalleled anywhere in the world. At a typical dry land site, we are left with only the most durable fragments of a culture: stone tools, pottery shards, and animal bones. But from the mud of the alpine lakes, we have recovered the Neolithic world in all its fragile organic detail. We have found not just the carbonized kernels of their wheat and barley, but perfectly preserved loaves of unleavened bread and crusts of porridge still stuck to the inside of their pots. We have their stored harvests of hazelnuts, the dried apples and pears they threaded onto strings to see them through the winter. We have not just the stone axe heads, but the entire axes, their polished stone heads still firmly attached to their beautifully carved wooden handles. We have their yew longbows and their arrows, complete with flint tips, glued on with birch bark tar and stabilized with feathers. We have their fishing nets, still knotted from the plant fibers their creators used, and even the dugout canoes they paddled across the water. Perhaps most astonishingly, we have their textiles. From these waterlogged sites come delicate fragments of woven linen cloth, some of the oldest fabrics in Europe, revealing a sophisticated knowledge of spinning and weaving. We can see the clothes they wore, the blankets they slept under. In a testament to the stunning level of preservation, archaeologists at one Swiss site even recovered a 5,000-year-old piece of chewing gum, a lump of birch bark tar, which has antiseptic properties, still bearing the clear imprint of a Neolithic person's teeth. The most famous individual to emerge from this alpine world was not found in a lake, but in the ice of a high mountain pass. In 1991, hikers discovered the astonishingly well-preserved, freeze-dried body of a man we now call Otzi, the Iceman. He lived around 3300 BC during the late Neolithic or Copper Age, and his body and possessions provide the ultimate personal glimpse into this lost world. He was dressed for the mountain cold in a sophisticated, multi-layered outfit of leggings, loincloth, and coat, all expertly stitched together from the skins of deer, goat, and sheep. He carried a flint dagger with an ash wood handle, a yew-long bow, and a quiver with arrows. Most significantly, he carried a magnificent copper-bladed axe, a symbol of the new age of metal that was just beginning to dawn. Forensic analysis revealed that Otzi had died violently. An arrowhead was found lodged in his left shoulder, and he had suffered a fatal blow to the head. He was a man on the run, a murder victim from 5,000 years ago, whose story is still being pieced together. From the perfectly preserved bread in the lake villages to the tattoos on Otzi's frozen skin, these unique alpine sites close the immense distance of time. They allow us to see the Neolithic world not just as a collection of stones and theories, but as a tangible reality of wooden bowls, woven fabrics, and everyday lives. A world of incredible ingenuity and adaptation, lived out on the beautiful and often dangerous edge of the water. In the heartlands of Neolithic Europe, from the great river valleys to the alpine lake shores, a new world was being built from timber. The great LBK longhouses and the sturdy pile dwellings were a testament to their builders' mastery of wood, a celebration of the vast primeval forest that covered the continent. But along the western edge of Europe, on the windswept shores of the Atlantic Ocean, a different architectural tradition was taking root. From the coasts of Portugal and Spain, up through France, and across the sea to the British Isles and Scandinavia, Neolithic communities were choosing to build, not with the perishable wood of the forest, but with a material that seemed to promise eternity: stone. This was the dawn of the megalithic age. The word megalith comes from the Greek megas, meaning great, and lithos, stone. It describes a truly global and long-lasting human impulse, the desire to build structures from enormous stones. But it was here, on the Atlantic facade of Neolithic Europe, that this tradition found its first and most spectacular expression. These were not finely dressed and mortared blocks, but massive, often raw, boulders and slabs, wrestled from the earth and arranged into powerful new forms. The simplest of these is the menhir, a single great standing stone, set upright in the landscape like a silent, brooding sentinel. More complex are the dolmens, the first and most basic form of megalithic tomb, where several upright stones are capped by a single, massive lintel stone, creating a simple, house-like chamber for the dead. And from this basic idea evolved the great passage graves, elaborate tombs with long stone-lined corridors leading to one or more burial chambers, all of which was then buried under a colossal man-made mound of earth or stone, known as a barrow or a cairn. For over a century, the origins of these incredible structures were explained by a simple, elegant, and completely wrong idea. The great civilizations of the ancient world, it was believed, were born in the Near East. Egypt had its pyramids, Mesopotamia, its ziggurats. It seemed obvious to the scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries that all great ideas, including the practice of building with large stones, must have originated there and then slowly spread, or diffused, out to the more primitive fringes of the world, like Western Europe. The megalith builders of Brittany and Ireland, it was assumed, were simply crude imitators of their more sophisticated Eastern masters. Then, in the mid-20th century, a scientific breakthrough shattered this long-held belief. The invention of radiocarbon dating allowed archaeologists to assign absolute dates to the organic materials, like charcoal or human bone, found within these tombs. At first, the dates seemed to confirm the diffusionist theory. But in the 1960s, scientists realized that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere had not been constant over time, and they devised a new method to calibrate the raw dates, making them far more accurate. When the archaeologist Colin Renfrew applied these new calibrated dates to the megaliths of Europe, the results were a revelation. The great passage tombs of Portugal, Spain, and Brittany were not younger than the pyramids. They were suddenly revealed to be more than 1,000 years older. This radiocarbon revolution was a turning point. It proved definitively that the European megalithic tradition was not a borrowed idea. It was an independent, indigenous invention, a phenomenon born on the wild coasts of the Atlantic. One of the earliest and most mind-boggling centers of this new tradition was the Carnac region of Brittany in northwestern France. Beginning as early as 4800 BC, the Neolithic people here began to erect stone structures on a truly epic scale. Most famous are the Carnac alignments and series of vast, parallel rows of standing stones that stretch for several kilometers across the landscape. The purpose of these thousands of menhirs marching in silent procession towards the horizon is one of archaeology's most profound mysteries. Were they a giant astronomical observatory, tracking the movements of the sun and moon? Were they sacred avenues for religious processions? Or were they a memorial to a great battle, each stone representing a fallen warrior? We may never know for sure. Alongside the alignments, the people of Karnak built some of the largest and oldest buildings on Earth. The Great Cairn of Barnenez, for instance, is a truly colossal passage tomb, a man-made mountain of stone containing 11 separate burial chambers, its oldest sections dating back to 4850 BC. It is a work of architecture on a scale that defies belief for its time, a Neolithic cathedral built centuries before the first towns of Mesopotamia. These were not just tombs for a single chief. They were collective burial vaults, sacred houses for the ancestors, used and reused by a community over many generations. Why did these coastal farming communities suddenly feel the need to embark on such astoundingly ambitious and labor-intensive projects? The answer lies in a new way of thinking about the world, a new ideology centered on ancestors, land, and permanence. In a world of growing populations, where different groups were competing for the best farmland and coastal resources, these great stone monuments were a powerful statement. They were undeniable territorial markers, a way for a community to declare, "This land is ours. It has belonged to us since the time of our great ancestors, and their very bones are buried within this stone mountain. The tombs were a physical anchor, linking the community to their specific place in the world through a direct line to their powerful ancestral spirits. The very act of building them was also a powerful social glue. The cooperation needed to quarry a 50-ton capstone, to move it for miles using nothing but log rollers, earthen ramps, and the brute strength of hundreds of people, and then to raise it into position, would have been the defining communal project of a generation. It was an investment of time and energy on a scale that is hard to comprehend, a testament to their social organization and their profound driving faith. From these heartlands in Brittany and Iberia, the idea of building with stone spread, likely carried by sea in the boats of coastal traders and colonists. It moved north to Ireland, home of the spectacular Newgrange tomb, to Britain, and on to Scandinavia, with each region developing its own unique style. The European megalithic tradition was not one unified religion, but a shared set of ideas and technologies, adapted and reinterpreted by local communities. A story told in 1,000 different dialects of stone. The great stone tombs that rose along the Atlantic coast were powerful statements, houses for the ancestors, built to last for eternity. This new and profound mastery of stone, this ideology of permanence, was most often dedicated to the world of the dead. But in a few remarkable places, this tradition was turned inward, used not just to honor the spirits, but to create an entire, living world of stone for the community itself. To find the most breathtaking example of this, we must continue our journey north, following the trail of the megalith builders to its farthest reaches, to a remote and windswept archipelago off the northern coast of Scotland. Here, in the Orkney Islands, the Neolithic culture did not just flourish, it reached a kind of golden age, creating a society so sophisticated and its monuments so grand that it is sometimes called the capital of Neolithic Britain. And nestled in a sandy bay on the edge of the wild Atlantic, it left behind the most perfectly preserved Neolithic village in all of Europe, a prehistoric Pompeii of stone called Skara Brae. The story of Skara Brae's discovery is almost as dramatic as the site itself. For thousands of years, the village lay completely hidden, buried and protected beneath a large sand dune known as Skara Brae, or the Hilly Dune. Then, in the winter of 1850, a colossal storm battered the islands with hurricane-force winds and mountainous waves. When the storm passed, the local villagers found that the wind had literally peeled the turf from the top of the dune, revealing the ghostly stone outlines of an ancient settlement beneath. What was slowly uncovered over the following decades was not just a collection of huts, but a complete, intact village. A place where time had seemingly stood still for 5,000 years. Dating from roughly 3100 BC to 2500 BC, Skara Brae is a marvel of Neolithic engineering and adaptation. The Orkney Islands have always been largely treeless, so the inhabitants built their entire world from the resources they had in abundance. The easily split flagstone of the coastline, and the turf and rubbish of their own making. The village consists of a tight cluster of at least 8 houses, sunk deep into the earth for stability and for insulation against the relentless Orcadian winds. These semi-subterranean dwellings were linked not by open streets, but by a series of low, narrow, stone-lined alleyways, which were themselves roofed over with stone slabs. The entire village was a single integrated complex, a cozy subterranean warren where the community could move about, sheltered from the howling gales and driving rain outside. It is when you step inside one of these houses that the true magic of Skara Brae is revealed. Because wood was so scarce, the villagers built not just their walls, but all their essential furniture out of stone. Each house, though slightly different, follows a remarkably consistent plan, giving us an unparalleled glimpse into their domestic lives. The entrance is a low tunnel-like passage, which could be sealed from the inside with a large stone slab and a securing bar. This opens into a single, large square room, at the center of which is a great stone hearth that was the heart of the home, providing light, warmth, and a place for cooking. Arranged around this central fire are the pieces of a Stone Age life. Against the far wall stands a large, multi-shelved stone structure that looks for all the world like a dresser. Here, the family would have displayed their most prized possessions, perhaps an unusual whalebone tool, a string of polished bone beads, or one of their distinctively decorated pottery vessels. On either side of the room are the beds, large, box-like stone enclosures, the one on the right always slightly larger than the one on the left, for reasons we don't yet understand. These boxes would have been filled with soft mattresses of heather and bracken, and lined with warm animal skins to create cozy, protected sleeping areas. Some houses have small, stone-lined tanks set flush into the floor near the entrance, which may have been used as limpet boxes, where they could keep this common type of shellfish fresh in salt water before a meal. A network of stone-lined drains even ran beneath the village, a surprisingly sophisticated sanitation system to channel away waste. Life for the people of Skara Brae was a delicate balance between farming and the sea. They were farmers, raising cattle and sheep, and growing barley in their small walled fields. But their rubbish heaps, known as middens, showed that they also relied heavily on the bounty of the ocean. They ate huge quantities of fish, crabs, and shellfish. They hunted the seals that basked on the shore and the vast colonies of seabirds that nested on the nearby cliffs. They were a hardy, self-sufficient people who had created a comfortable and surprisingly complex society in a challenging, treeless environment. Like Catalhoyuk, the village appears to have been a remarkably egalitarian community. All the houses are of a similar size, with the same set of stone furniture, suggesting that no single individual or family held significant power or wealth over the others. Their spiritual life connected them to the wider Orcadian world. The mysterious carved symbols found at Skara Brae, spirals, chevrons, and lozenges, are the same motifs found within the great chambered tombs of the islands, like Meshue, linking the domestic world of the living with the sacred ancestral world of the dead. After some 600 years of continuous occupation, the village was abandoned. The old romantic theory was that the inhabitants had been forced to flee in a panic from a single, catastrophic sandstorm that buried their homes in an instant. But modern archaeology tells a more subtle story. The abandonment was likely a gradual process. Over centuries, the village's own rubbish heaps and the encroaching sand of the bay made life increasingly difficult. A shift to a colder, wetter climate may have also strained their farming economy. The people of Skara Brae did not likely flee in terror. They simply moved on, bit by bit, leaving their stone homes to be slowly and gently covered by the shifting sands, which would preserve their world perfectly for the next 5 millennia. From the intimate stone-built homes of Skara Brae to the great ancestral tombs that dotted the Atlantic coast, the Neolithic peoples of Britain were expressing a deep and powerful connection to stone. They saw in it a permanence that stood in contrast to their own fleeting lives, a material fit for honoring the ancestors and marking a place in the world. This tradition of building with stone, this megalithic ideology, would reach its most ambitious, most sophisticated, and most enigmatic peak on a windswept chalk plateau in southern England. Here on the Salisbury Plain, generations of people would dedicate themselves to a single, evolving project of unimaginable scale and precision, creating not just a monument, but an entire sacred landscape, at the heart of which stood the world's most famous prehistoric temple, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is not a single structure, but a monument that was built, dismantled, and radically redesigned over a period of at least 1,500 years. Its story is one of multiple phases, each representing a new wave of belief and a new feat of engineering. The first major construction, around 3000 BC, was not a stone circle at all. It was a massive circular earthwork, a type of monument known as a henge, consisting of a deep, circular ditch and an inner bank, about 110 meters in diameter. Just inside this bank, the builders dug a ring of 56 deep pits, which we now call the Aubrey holes. These likely held massive timber posts, creating a great circle of wood. This first Stonehenge was also one of Britain's largest early cemeteries. The Aubrey holes and the surrounding ditch were filled with the cremated remains of dozens of individuals, their ashes placed in bags or simple vessels. From its very beginning, this was a place deeply connected to the dead. For several centuries, this great wooden circle was the focus of ritual. Then, around 2600 BC, a radical and astonishing new plan was put into motion. The timber posts were removed, and the people began a new project, one that speaks of a devotion so profound it is almost impossible for us to comprehend. They decided to rebuild the circle in stone, but not with any local stone. They chose a very specific type of rock, a collection of spotted dolerites and rhyolites known collectively as bluestones. The source of these stones was not on the Salisbury Plain, but in the Preseli Hills of Western Wales, more than 150 miles away. Each of these stones, weighing between 2 and 4 tons, was quarried from its mother rock and then transported across this vast distance. The journey would have been a staggering feat, likely involving dragging the great stones on wooden sledges overland and loading them onto rafts to navigate the Bristol Channel and the rivers of southern England. Why go to such extraordinary lengths? The bluestones must have been seen as possessing immense power, perhaps healing properties, or a direct connection to the ancestral homeland. Before the bluestone circle was even completed, however, another, even more ambitious phase of construction began around 2500 BC. This phase saw the arrival of the true giants of Stonehenge, the Sarsens. These are massive blocks of incredibly hard sandstone quarried from the Marlborough Downs, about 20 miles to the north. These were the stones that would create the iconic monument we know today. The builders dragged more than 80 of these colossal stones, some weighing over 40 tons, to the site. Here, unlike almost any other megalithic monument in Europe, they did not just erect the raw stones. They shaped and dressed them with painstaking precision, using heavy stone mauls to pound the surfaces smooth. They then raised the great outer circle of 30 upright sarcens, and in a feat of breathtaking skill, lifted a continuous ring of 30 lintel stones on top of them. At the center of this, they erected an inner horseshoe of 5 massive trilithons, each consisting of 2 colossal uprights capped by a single lintel, the largest of which towers more than 25 feet into the air. What is most remarkable is the technique they used. They were employing sophisticated woodworking joints in stone. The lintels were locked onto the uprights using mortise and tenon joints, a projecting peg on one stone fitting snugly into a carved hole on the other. The lintels of the outer circle were further locked to each other using tongue and groove joints. They even carved the stones with subtle optical refinements, making the uprights bulge slightly in the middle to counteract the illusion of them looking thinner from a distance. This was not primitive building. It was architectural genius of the highest order. What was the purpose of this immense, multi-generational effort? Stonehenge was undeniably a temple, but a temple with many functions. Its most famous feature is its alignment with the cosmos. The entire structure is oriented along an axis that points directly to the sunrise on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and to the sunset on the winter solstice, the shortest day. It was a great, perpetual calendar, a place where the community could gather to mark the turning of the seasons, a critical function for an agricultural society. But it was also a place for the dead. The monument is at the heart of the densest concentration of Neolithic and Bronze Age burial mounds in all of Britain. It seems to have been the center of a ritual landscape that separated the domain of the living, which was associated with wooden structures like the vast nearby settlement of Durrington Walls, from the domain of the dead and the ancestors, which was associated with the permanence of stone. Recent research has also reinforced the idea of Stonehenge as a place of healing. Analysis of the human remains buried around the site shows that many individuals had suffered from severe illness and gruesome injuries. It seems that people from across Britain, and perhaps even from mainland Europe, made arduous pilgrimages to this spot, hoping that the sacred power of the stones, particularly the blue stones, brought from so far away, might cure their ailments. Stonehenge, then, was a cathedral, a cemetery, an astronomical observatory, and a lords of the Neolithic world, all in one. It was the sacred center of a powerful and increasingly hierarchical society, whose leaders could command the labor and faith of thousands, creating a monument to their beliefs that would endure for millennia. Its silent stones still keeping their secrets on the Salisbury Plain. While the Neolithic communities of the Atlantic coast were pouring their collective energy into the silent, eternal language of stone, creating monuments to their ancestors that would dialogue with the cosmos, a very different story was unfolding in southeastern Europe. In the fertile river valleys of the Balkans, the descendants of the first farmers to enter the continent were not building with megaliths. Their energies were focused elsewhere, on creating large, bustling, and long-lasting towns, on mastering revolutionary new technologies, and on developing a rich symbolic world so complex that it has led to one of the most tantalizing and controversial claims in archaeology, that here in the heart of old Europe, the world's first system of writing may have been born. This was the world of the Vincha culture, flourishing for more than 1,000 years, from roughly 5700 to 4500 BC. The Vincha culture dominated a huge area of what is now Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. This was a land of rich soils and temperate forests, drained by the mighty Danube River and its tributaries. Here, the Neolithic way of life did not just take root, it blossomed into a society of remarkable sophistication. The Vincha people built their settlements in the same spot for centuries, creating great occupation mounds, or tells, that grew into some of the largest and most densely populated centers in all of Neolithic Europe. At sites like Vincha Belobrdo, the culture's namesake, located just outside modern Belgrade, these villages grew into true proto-towns, housing thousands of people. Their homes were not the simple huts of pioneer farmers. They built substantial rectangular houses with multiple rooms, using a sophisticated wattle and daub technique over a sturdy timber frame. These houses had gabled roofs, plastered walls and floors, and even built-in clay furniture like ovens, benches, and storage bins. Intriguingly, many of these well-built homes seem to have been intentionally and ritually burned down after a period of use, after which a new house would be constructed directly on top of the old foundations, a cyclical act of closure and renewal that helped to create the great dells. But the most distinctive feature of the Vincha world is the sheer abundance of their art, specifically the thousands upon thousands of stylized ceramic figurines they left behind. Found in almost every house, these are not simple, crude idols. They are works of great expressive power. While many are female, they are not the voluptuous Venus figures of the earlier Ice Age. Vincha figures are often slender and poised, with elaborate clothing and jewelry incised directly onto the clay. Their most striking feature is their faces, typically triangular or five-sided, with huge, hypnotic, almond-shaped eyes that stare out across the millennia. Many appear to be wearing masks, suggesting their use in complex religious ceremonies. These were not children's toys. They were likely representations of deities, ancestors, or spirits, and their constant presence within the home suggests that for the Vincha, ritual was not a separate public act, but was woven deeply into the fabric of daily domestic life. The Vincha were not just artists. They were also brilliant technological innovators. At sites like Belovod in Serbia, archaeologists have found the oldest securely dated evidence for copper smelting anywhere in the world, dating back to around 5000 BC. This was not just the simple hammering of native copper. This was true metallurgy, the complex process of using high-temperature kilns to extract pure metal from its ore. The Vincha were the world's first coppersmiths, a discovery that pushes the dawn of the Age of Metals back into Neolithic Europe, long before it began in the Near East. It is this combination of a large, settled population, a rich ritual life, and technological prowess that provides the context for their most enigmatic legacy, the Vincha symbols. Inscribed on pottery, on spindle whorls, and most famously, on the bases of their figurines, is a collection of standardized abstract signs. They appear at sites across the entire Vincha territory, a shared symbolic vocabulary used for over 1,000 years. The signs are linear and geometric: chevrons, crosses, spirals, comb-like patterns, and swastikas. The discovery in 1961 of 3 small inscribed clay tablets at Târtăria in Romania, found in what appeared to be a ritual pit, ignited a firestorm of debate that continues to this day. Was this simply a collection of religious symbols, or was it something more? This is the great Vincha mystery. Did they invent writing? Proponents of the theory argue that the standardized, widespread, and repetitive nature of the signs proves that this was a genuine script, a Danube script or Old European script that predates the earliest Sumerian cuneiform by at least 1,000 years. If this were true, it would mean that the very first chapter in the story of literacy was written not in Mesopotamia, but in the Balkans. However, the majority of mainstream archaeologists and linguists remain unconvinced. They argue that while the Vincha symbols are clearly a highly developed and complex system of symbolic communication, they fall short of being a true writing system. True writing, they contend, must be able to represent the full range of a spoken language with rules of grammar and syntax. The Vincha inscriptions are always incredibly short, usually just a single sign or a small cluster of them. There are no long texts, no evidence of the complex arrangements of signs needed to record a sentence or a narrative. Their context is always ritual or personal. They are never used for the kind of administrative or economic record keeping that drove the development of cuneiform. The consensus view is that this was a highly sophisticated system of religious notation, of ownership marks, or sacred symbols, but not a script for recording language. Whether it was true writing or not, the Vincha symbols are a testament to the intellectual sophistication of this remarkable culture. They were a people who stood on the very threshold of literacy, a society of bustling towns, brilliant artists, and the world's first metallurgists, who created a unique and powerful civilization in the heart of old Europe. Their hypnotic, wide-eyed figurines still challenging us with the mystery of their lost meaning. The enigmatic symbols of the Vincha, the world's first coppersmiths, show us a Neolithic society in the Balkans that was streaking ahead, a culture of bustling towns and technological wonders. Their story, like that of the stone builders of Stonehenge and the lake dwellers of the Alps, is a chapter in the great book of how agriculture remade Europe. But the entire narrative we have followed so far, the story of wheat and barley, of cattle and sheep, a story that began in the Fertile Crescent and spread outwards, is just one of the great epics of the Neolithic Age. For halfway around the world, an entirely separate parallel revolution was taking place. On the great river plains of ancient China, different people were forging a new relationship with different plants and animals, embarking on their own unique journey from foraging to farming. This was not a sequel or a copy. It was a completely independent invention of the Neolithic way of life. Ancient China, much like today, was a land of immense geographical diversity, and this diversity gave rise to not one, but two distinct cradles of agriculture. In the north, the landscape is dominated by the Yellow River, the Huanghe, which flows through a vast plateau of fine wind-blown yellow-brown silt known as loess. This is a semi-arid, colder region with harsh winters and warm, dry summers. Here, the wild grasses that would form the foundation of civilization were not wheat or barley, but two incredibly hardy and drought-resistant species, foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. In the south, the landscape is defined by the mighty Yangtze River, the Changjiang. This is a world away from the dry Loess Plateau. It is a warmer, wetter, almost subtropical region of lakes, marshes, and winding river valleys. Here, in the shallow, sun-warmed waters of the wetlands, grew the ancestor of what would become the staple food for more than half of the world's population today: wild rice, The story of the North is the story of millet. Beginning as early as 8000 BC, at sites associated with cultures like the Peligang and the Kishan, we see the first signs of millet domestication. Much like the process in the Fertile Crescent, this was likely a slow journey of unconscious selection. Hunter-gatherers would have harvested the wild millet, and in doing so, would have favored those rare mutant plants whose seeds clung more tightly to the stalk. Over centuries, they bred a new plant that was perfect for their needs, a reliable grain that could be grown in the challenging northern climate. The villages of these first millet farmers consisted of clusters of simple, semi-subterranean pit houses, their floors sunk into the earth for insulation. They made coarse, low-fired pottery, essential for both storing their millet harvest and for cooking it into the nourishing porridge that formed the basis of their diet. Alongside their crops, they raised domesticated animals, but their farmyards looked very different from those in the West. Their primary source of meat was not cattle or sheep, which were unknown to them, but the pig, domesticated from the wild boars of the surrounding forests. They also kept dogs, a legacy from their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The story of the South is the story of rice. The domestication of rice was a far more complex and labor-intensive process, a true masterpiece of ecological engineering. Wild rice, Oryza rufipogon, grows naturally in swamps and wetlands. The first people to exploit it, like those of the Pengtushan culture around 7500 BC, were likely collectors who waded into the natural marshes to harvest the wild grains. But over time, they began to actively manage these environments. They would have learned to control water levels, to clear away competing weeds, and to transplant the most productive wild plants to new, more convenient locations. This intensive hands-on management, year after year, slowly transformed the plant and the landscape. Humans selected for rice plants with larger grains, non-shattering seed heads, and a weaker dormancy, ensuring the seeds would sprout reliably when planted. In doing so, they created not just a new plant, domesticated rice, but an entirely new kind of environment, the artificial wetland we call a paddy. The creation of the rice paddy was a monumental act of landscape transformation, requiring the construction of dikes and canals to manage the flow of water with incredible precision. This process, which began in the swamps of the Yangtze Valley, would eventually create the iconic terraced landscapes of southern China. What is so fascinating is that while the specific plants and animals were different, the basic toolkit of the Neolithic that emerged in China shows remarkable parallels to the West. Both the millet farmers of the north and the rice farmers of the south developed polished stone tools, axes for clearing forests, and spades and hoes for tilling the soil. And both cultures relied heavily on pottery. In fact, the oldest pottery in the world comes from southern China, from the cave of Shenrendong, where hunter-gatherers were making simple ceramic vessels as far back as 20,000 years ago, long before the invention of agriculture. For the farmers, these pots became essential for the daily tasks of storing water, protecting seeds from pests, and, most importantly, for boiling the grains that were the foundation of their diet. The Neolithic Revolution in China was a completely homegrown affair. It was not sparked by ideas or seeds arriving from the West. It was an independent discovery, or rather, two independent discoveries, built on local plants and local ingenuity. It is a powerful reminder that the shift to agriculture was not a singular event, but a fundamental change in the human condition. A path that different peoples around the world embarked upon separately when the climatic conditions of the Holocene made it both possible and necessary. The millet of the north and the rice of the south would go on to shape the destiny of East Asia, just as wheat and barley shaped the West. History, it turns out, is not a single river flowing from one source, but a series of great parallel streams, each finding its own course towards the sea. The great parallel streams of Chinese agriculture, one born of millet in the dry northern plains and the other of rice in the wet southern marshes, created two distinct foundations for civilization in East Asia. This new security, this release from the constant wandering and uncertainty of the hunt, did more than just fill people's stomachs and allow their villages to grow. It also freed their time, their hands, and their minds to pursue endeavors beyond mere survival. It created the space for art, for ritual, and for beauty to flourish in new and sophisticated ways. At one remarkable village, located in the transitional zone between these two great streams, archaeologists have uncovered a treasure that gives us not just a glimpse into this new world, but a chance to actually hear it. This is the story of the flutes of Jiahu. The site of Jiahu, located in the central Chinese province of Henan, was a large and prosperous village, occupied for more than 1,000 years, from roughly 7,000 to 5,700 BC. It was a community that enjoyed the best of both of China's new worlds. They were sophisticated farmers, cultivating the northern grain, millet, but they had also adopted the southern grain, rice, which they grew in managed paddy-like fields. Alongside their crops, they continued to hunt deer and wild boar, to fish for carp in the nearby rivers, and to gather wild foods like acorns and water chestnuts. This rich, diverse economy supported a thriving community, one that was clearly engaged in a deep and complex cultural life. In the graves of certain individuals at Jiahu, archaeologists found the village's most astonishing secret. Carefully placed alongside the deceased were musical instruments of breathtaking elegance and sophistication. Flutes crafted from the hollow wing bones of the red-crowned crane. The red-crowned crane is a large, magnificent bird that has held a powerful place in East Asian mythology for centuries, often symbolizing longevity and transcendence. The choice of this specific bone was clearly a deliberate and meaningful act. Over 30 such flutes, in various states of preservation, have been unearthed at Jiahu, making them the largest and oldest collection of playable musical instruments ever discovered. These are not simple whistles or crude sound makers. They are true musical instruments, crafted with a remarkable understanding of acoustics. The Neolithic artisans who made them would select a long, straight ulna from the crane's wing. They would cut it to the desired length, clean and polish it, and then drill a series of finger holes along its length with incredible precision. The flutes vary in size and number of holes, with the most complete examples having 7 or 8. The most extraordinary revelation came when musicologists and physicists began to study them. They are not just playable, but they are tuned to a recognizable musical scale. When researchers created precise replicas, they found that the most famous of the Jiahu flutes, a perfectly preserved 7-holed instrument, can produce a tonal scale that closely follows the familiar Western major scale. A piece of music played on this 9,000-year-old instrument is not a chaotic series of shrieks, but a coherent and haunting melody. This discovery pushes back the history of music itself. It demonstrates that as early as 7000 BC, people possessed not just the impulse to make music, but a highly developed cognitive understanding of pitch, harmony, and scale. These were not instruments for idle entertainment. Their careful placement in graves, often with other ritual objects, strongly suggests they were sacred items used in religious or shamanistic ceremonies. Their clear, high-pitched notes might have been used to accompany sacred songs or dances, to mediate between the worlds of the living and the spirits, or perhaps to guide the soul of the deceased on its journey into the afterlife. The sound of the crane-bone flute was the sound of ritual, a way of bringing a moment of transcendent beauty into their lives. The flutes were not the only evidence of Jiahu's surprisingly advanced culture. In the same graves, archaeologists found pottery jars containing the chemical residue of the world's oldest known alcoholic beverage. By analyzing these residues, they were able to determine the recipe, a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. This Neolithic mead, or wine, was almost certainly a ritual beverage, consumed during ceremonies to alter consciousness and facilitate communion with the spirit world. And there is one more mystery at Jiahu, one that echoes the story of the Vincha culture in Europe. On a number of tortoise shells and pieces of bone found in the same graves, the people of Jiahu had carved a series of signs. These symbols, some 9,000 years old, are even older than the Vincha script. They are simple, pictograph-like markings, and a few of them bear a startling resemblance to characters from the much later, fully developed Chinese writing system. For instance, one carving is almost identical to the modern Chinese character for I. This has led to the electrifying, though highly controversial suggestion that these Jiahu symbols might represent the most ancient, distant ancestors of Chinese script. While most scholars consider them to be proto-writing or symbolic emblems rather than a true language, they are, at the very least, evidence of a community using abstract signs to record and transmit meaning. Jiahu shatters any simplistic image we might have of the early Neolithic. These were not just subsistence farmers struggling to survive. They were a people with a rich inner life, a community of musicians, brewers, and thinkers. They possessed a sophisticated understanding of acoustics, a taste for intoxicating beverages, and a symbolic system that brought them to the very dawn of writing. We can only imagine the scene, a ritual gathering in the firelight, the community sharing a sweet, potent drink, while a shaman or elder raises a polished bone flute to their lips. And for a moment, across a gulf of 9,000 years, we can almost hear the clear, haunting notes of their music, the oldest songs of the New Stone Age. The haunting 9,000-year-old melodies played on the crane-bone flutes of Jiahu are a powerful reminder that the Neolithic Revolution was not a uniform event, but a story with many different voices played out in different keys. The great agricultural traditions of the Fertile Crescent and China were two of the grand parallel symphonies of this new age. But our story has a third, equally momentous movement, one that was composed in complete isolation from the others. To hear it, we must leave the continents of the Old World behind and journey across the now submerged land bridge of Berinia into a new hemisphere. Here in the Americas, a different set of peoples, faced with a different set of challenges and opportunities, would embark on their own unique path to agriculture. The first peoples to enter the Americas, likely around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, were skilled Ice Age hunter-gatherers. They entered a land teeming with unfamiliar megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and native horses and camels. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, however, most of these large species were gone, likely due to a combination of climate change and hunting pressure. This mass extinction event had a profound consequence that would shape the entire future of the continents. It left the Americas with almost no large animals suitable for domestication. There were no wild cattle, no wild sheep, no wild goats, no wild pigs. The only exceptions would be the llamas and alpacas of the distant Andes and the wild turkey. This meant that the Neolithic Revolution in the Americas would be an almost entirely plant-based affair. It would be a story without shepherds and pastoralists, a world without the plow or the cart. One of the great cradles of this new American agriculture was Mesoamerica, the diverse geographical region that stretches from central Mexico down to Central America. Here, in a landscape of volcanic highlands, arid valleys, and humid tropical lowlands, ancient foragers began to experiment with the local flora, slowly domesticating a suite of plants that would form the foundation of great civilizations. Their agricultural system, which evolved over thousands of years, is often called the Three Sisters, a trinity of crops so perfectly complementary that their combined cultivation is a masterpiece of symbiotic engineering. The sisters are maize, beans, and squash. The first of the sisters to be brought into the human fold was likely squash, domesticated as early as 8000 BC. Initially, it may have been cultivated not for its flesh, but for its other useful properties. Its hard, dried rind could be used to make excellent waterproof containers, bowls, and ladles, while its nutritious seeds were a valuable source of protein and oils. The last of the sisters to be domesticated, much later, were beans. But it is the middle sister, the one at the heart of the system, that represents one of the most astonishing feats of genetic modification in human history. This is the story of maize, or corn. The wild ancestor of maize is a scruffy-looking Mexican grass called teosinte. To look at teosinte is to see no hint of its magnificent descendant. It is a branching, bushy plant, and its ears are tiny, pathetic things, consisting of just a single row of 5 to 12 kernels. And each of these kernels is locked away inside a casing as hard as a rock, making it almost inedible. The transformation from this unpromising wild grass into the plump, soft, multi-road cobs of maize we know today was so radical that for a long time, botanists couldn't even believe they were related. This transformation was the slow, patient work of ancient peoples in the highland valleys of Mexico, beginning around 7000 BC. Through a process of conscious selection that must have spanned millennia, they chose and replanted the seeds from those rare mutant teosinte plants that showed even slightly favorable traits. A larger kernel here, a softer casing there. It was an act of co-evolutionary vision, a shaping of nature so profound that it could be called the world's first great act of genetic engineering. What makes the Three Sisters truly brilliant, however, is not just the plants themselves, but how they are grown together in a single field, a system known as a milpa. This is a form of intercropping that creates a small, self-sustaining ecosystem. First, the maize is planted. As its tall, sturdy stalk grows, it provides a natural pole for the next sister, the bean, to climb, lifting its leaves towards the sunlight. The bean, in turn, performs a vital service for the maize. Its roots host nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which draw nitrogen from the air and convert it into a natural fertilizer in the soil, enriching the ground for the nutrient-hungry maize. Finally, the third sister, squash, is planted at the base of the maize and beans. Its broad, sprawling vines and large leaves spread out across the ground, forming a living mulch that shades the soil, preventing water from evaporating and blocking the growth of weeds. This symbiosis extends to the dinner plate. The three sisters provide a perfectly balanced and sustainable diet. The maize offers carbohydrates for energy. The beans are rich in protein, and crucially, they provide the essential amino acids, lysine and tryptophan, that are missing in maize. The squash provides a wealth of different vitamins and healthy fats. Together, they are a complete nutritional package, the foundation of a healthy life, all grown from a single, self-fertilizing, and weed-resistant field. Unlike in the Fertile Crescent, where the Neolithic package seems to have come together relatively quickly, the Mesoamerican Revolution was a much slower, more drawn-out affair. These three key plants were domesticated in different places and at different times over a span of thousands of years. For a long time, they were simply minor additions to a diet that still relied heavily on hunting and gathering. It was not until around 2000 BC that villages and societies based almost entirely on the three sisters began to emerge. It was a slow, patient revolution, but one whose impact would be no less profound. This ingenious agricultural system, born in the highlands of Mexico, would fuel the rise of the great Olmec, Maya, Toltec, and Aztec civilizations, a testament to a completely independent and equally brilliant discovery of the Neolithic way of life. The story of the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, is the story of how agriculture was born in the heart of Mesoamerica, a revolution of plants that would one day fuel great empires. Yet this was only one of the America's two great Neolithic narratives. Thousands of miles to the south, along the vast, mountainous spine of the South American continent, another set of peoples were embarking on a completely separate, equally brilliant agricultural journey. In one of the most challenging and dramatic landscapes on Earth, they would tame a unique collection of plants and animals, creating a thriving Neolithic world in the sky. The world of the Andes. The Andes Mountains are not a single, uniform environment. They are what geographers call a vertical archipelago, a series of distinct ecological zones stacked one on top of the other, from the sea to the sky. At the bottom is the Pacific coast, one of the driest deserts in the world, where life is possible only in the narrow, fertile river valleys that cut through it, fed by the mountain snows. Above this is the Sierra, the high mountain valleys, and the vast cold windswept plateaus of the Altiplano. And on the other side, the mountains fall away into the humid, tropical cloud forests of the Amazon basin. To live here successfully required not one solution, but a complex system of adaptation to this vertical world. The familiar staples of Mesoamerica were not the answer here. Instead, the Andean peoples domesticated an entirely different suite of crops, perfectly suited to the high-altitude environment. The undisputed star of the Andean agricultural system was the potato. In the cool highlands around Lake Titicaca, as early as 8000 BC, ancient foragers began to cultivate the small, hardy, and often bitter wild tubers that grew there. Over thousands of years of careful selection, they would breed this humble plant into the nutritious, versatile potato we know today, eventually creating thousands of different varieties adapted to different altitudes, soils, and climates. Alongside the potato, they domesticated quinoa, a protein-rich pseudo-cereal whose seeds could be ground into flour and which thrived in the thin, cold air where maize could not grow. Down on the coast, in the irrigated river valleys, a different agricultural package emerged, including lima beans, peanuts, and most importantly, cotton. The soft, strong fibers of domesticated cotton would become the raw material for one of the most sophisticated and symbolically important textile traditions in the ancient world. But the most significant difference between the Andean and Mesoamerican worlds was the presence of large, domesticable animals. In the high grasslands of the Sierra, ancient hunters began the long process of taming the wild camelids of the region. From the wild guanaco, they bred the llama, and from the wild vicuña, they bred the alpaca. This was a pivotal achievement. The llama became the only beast of burden in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its ability to carry heavy loads up and down the steep mountain paths, making it the backbone of a vast trade network that connected the coast, the highlands, and the jungle. The alpaca, meanwhile, was bred for its incredibly soft, fine fleece, which was spun and woven into beautiful, high-status textiles that were more valuable than gold. And in their homes, they domesticated a smaller creature, the guinea pig, or cuy, which became a vital and efficient source of meat. The Andes, therefore, had something Mesoamerica did not: a true mixed farming economy, a world of both farmers and pastoralists. This secure foundation of high-altitude tubers and domesticated herds allowed for the rise of large settled communities and stunning ceremonial centers. The most spectacular and mysterious of these early societies is known as the Norte Chico or Carral-Supe civilization, which emerged on the dry coast of modern-day Peru. Its age is staggering. Flourishing from around 3000 to 1800 BC, it is the oldest known complex civilization in the Americas, a contemporary of the Old Kingdom pyramids of Egypt and the first city-states of Sumeria. At sites like the city of Carral, these people built huge, complex urban centers. They constructed enormous earthen platform mounds, some as large as a football field, topped with temple complexes. They engineered vast sunken circular plazas for public ceremonies and built extensive residential districts. Yet Carral is a profound puzzle that challenges many of our assumptions about how civilizations arise. This incredibly complex society emerged without the benefit of several key technologies. They had no pottery, they had no system of writing, and most surprisingly of all, their diet was not based on a staple grain like wheat or maize. So how did they feed the thousands of people needed to build these great monuments? The answer, it seems, lay in a unique economic relationship between the coast and the interior. The people of inland cities like Carral grew vast quantities of industrial crops, particularly cotton and gourds. They would then trade these goods with the fishing communities on the coast in exchange for the ocean's immense bounty. The foundation of their diet was a massive supply of dried anchovies and sardines, a source of protein so rich and reliable that it could fuel an entire civilization. This has led to the maritime foundations of Andean civilization theory. The idea that here in the Americas, one of the world's first great civilizations, was built not on grain, but on cotton and fish. The story of the Andean Neolithic is a powerful testament to human ingenuity. In a vertical world of extreme challenges, its people created a unique and enduring agricultural system based on potatoes and llamas instead of wheat and cattle. Their early and rapid rise to a complex urban society built on a novel economic foundation demonstrates yet again that there was no single universal path to civilization. Each great revolution was a local masterpiece, a creative and specific answer to the universal human quest for a more stable and meaningful life. From the high, cold plains of the Andes, our story of the Neolithic has taken us to the cradles of civilization in the Americas, revealing a hemisphere of independent innovation. We have now visited the four great, well-known centers of agricultural origin: the Fertile Crescent with its wheat and cattle, China with its rice and millet, Mesoamerica with its trinity of maize, beans, and squash, and the Andes with their potatoes and llamas. It would be easy to conclude our survey here, to assume that these were the only places where humanity made that great leap. But there is at least one more great, and perhaps most surprising, chapter to this story. To find it, we must journey to a place of almost unimaginable biodiversity and rugged beauty, a land of dense rainforests, steaming swamps, and cloud-wreathed mountains, the massive tropical island of New Guinea. For a long time, it was assumed that the people of New Guinea had not developed agriculture independently, but had learned it from Austronesian migrants who arrived on the island much later. The island's environment seemed to lack the key ingredients for an indigenous agricultural revolution. There were no native grasses that could be domesticated into staple grains, and with the exception of the pig, which arrived with later migrations, there were no large domesticable animals. But pioneering archaeological work at a place called Cook's Swamp in the highlands of New Guinea has completely rewritten this story, revealing a tradition of farming so ancient and so unique that it forces us to widen our very definition of what agriculture is. Cook's Swamp is a large waterlogged basin, and like the lake dwellings of the Alps, its oxygen-poor mud has preserved a remarkable and fragile record of the past. But the evidence found here was not of houses or tools, but of the landscape itself. As archaeologists dug down through the layers of peat, they uncovered the unmistakable traces of an ancient and sophisticated farming system. The ghostly outlines of ditches for drainage, of channels for irrigation, and of regular raised mounds where crops had been planted. The most astonishing part was the age of this activity. The deepest and oldest layers of human intervention at Cook's Swamp, including pits, stake holes, and signs of forest clearing along the swamp's edge, date back to around 8000 BC, or 10,000 years before the present. This is a date that rivals the very beginnings of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. The evidence becomes even clearer in later layers. By 5000 BC, the people of Cook were systematically creating large, rounded mounds of earth, a way of raising their crops above the waterlogged soil. And by 2000 BC, they were operating a complex and interconnected network of drainage ditches, a sign of a well-organized, large-scale agricultural society. So what were these ancient gardeners growing? Because seeds and tubers do not preserve well in the acidic tropical soil, the evidence is indirect, coming from microscopic starch grains found on the edges of stone tools, and from analyzing the types of plants that would thrive in such a modified swamp environment. The picture that emerges is of a completely different kind of agriculture, one based not on seeds, but on roots and shoots. This is often called vegiculture. Their staple foods were starchy root crops, most importantly, taro, with its large edible corms, and various species of yam. These plants are not grown from seed, but are propagated vegetatively by planting a cutting or a piece of the root from the parent plant. But the innovations of these New Guinean pioneers did not stop there. It was here, in the highlands of New Guinea, that two of the world's most important and beloved crops were first domesticated from their wild ancestors, sugarcane and bananas. Like taro and yams, these are also cultivated from cuttings and suckers, not from seed. The people of Cook Swamp were not grain farmers. They were the world's first tropical gardeners, and their legacy, in the form of these sweet and vital crops, would eventually spread across the entire globe. The evidence from Cook Swamp is a powerful confirmation that the Neolithic Revolution was not a one-off event that spread from a single source, but a global human phenomenon. The ancient peoples of New Guinea, working in complete isolation with a completely different set of plants, independently developed a sophisticated and sustainable system of agriculture. And they did it just as early as anyone else in the world. This remarkable discovery, however, also raises a profound question, a great historical paradox. If agriculture in New Guinea is so ancient, why did its history play out so differently from that of Eurasia? Why did New Guinea produce the large, dense populations, the cities, the metal tools, the writing systems, and the great empires that arose in the wake of the grain-based revolutions? This question was famously explored by the scientist and historian Jared Diamond, and the answer seems to lie not in the people, whose ingenuity is undeniable, but in the raw biological and geographical hand they were dealt. The crops they domesticated, while productive, were lower in protein than the wheat, barley, and pulses of Eurasia. Their agriculture was also more labor-intensive and harder to expand and store on a massive scale. Most crucially, they lacked the big five domesticable animals. They had no cattle or goats for milk and protein, no sheep for wool, and no horses or oxen to pull plows, which would have allowed them to cultivate much larger areas of land. Finally, the incredibly rugged, mountainous terrain of the island itself created a barrier, making it difficult for populations to connect, for ideas and technologies to spread, and for large, centralized political states to form. The ancient gardeners of New Guinea represent a vital and often forgotten chapter in our story. Their independent invention of veg culture is a stunning testament to human creativity. Their history is also a powerful lesson in the importance of biogeography, a reminder that the tools and resources provided by the local environment can profoundly shape the long-term trajectory of a society. They show us, once again, that the Neolithic was not a single path, but a branching tree of possibilities. Our journey has now taken us around the globe, from the highlands of New Guinea to the mountains of the Andes, from the river valleys of China to the coasts of Mesoamerica. We have seen that the Neolithic Revolution was not one story, but many, a chorus of independent inventions and adaptations. Yet, despite the immense diversity of their crops, their customs, and their environments, a remarkable convergence appears when we look at the tools, these first farmers held in their hands. Whether they were clearing a patch of European forest to plant wheat or preparing a garden for taro in a tropical swamp, they all relied on a surprisingly similar and profoundly effective set of implements. This was the essential hardware of the new agricultural age, the universal Neolithic toolkit. At the very heart of this toolkit, and perhaps its most transformative component, was the polished stone axe. For hundreds of thousands of years during the Paleolithic, our ancestors had been masters of knapping, the technique of shaping stone by striking it to flake off pieces. This method is perfect for creating sharp-edged but brittle tools like spear points and scrapers. But for the heavy-duty work of felling a mature oak tree, a simple flaked stone axe was inefficient and likely to shatter. The Neolithic innovation was to take a tough, hard stone like basalt or flint, flake it into a rough shape, and then begin the laborious process of grinding and polishing it. For hours upon end, the toolmaker would rub the axe head against an abrasive rock like sandstone, using sand and water as a grinding paste. This patient, repetitive work produced a tool with a completely different character. The polished axe head had a smooth surface and a strong, tough, and incredibly durable cutting edge that could withstand the repeated, high-impact blows of chopping wood. It could be resharpened time and time again, making it a tool that could last a lifetime. The polished stone axe was the Neolithic equivalent of the chainsaw. With it, for the first time in history, people could systematically clear the dense, primeval forests that had reclaimed the world after the Ice Age. The sharp, rhythmic crack of the axe biting into timber was the sound of a new world being made. The sound of forests becoming fields, of wildlands becoming farmland, and of great trees becoming the posts and beams of the first longhouses. Once the fields were cleared and the crops had grown, another essential tool came into play: the sickle. As we saw with the Natufians, this tool was the key to an efficient harvest, the instrument that allowed humans to gather in the vast solar energy stored in the fields of grain. Early sickles were composite tools, a series of small, sharp flint blades, or microliths, set into a curved handle of wood or bone. Over time, in some regions, these evolved into beautiful single-piece sickles, napped from a large piece of flint into an elegant curved blade. But whatever its form, the sickle's function was the same: to sever the stalks of grain, allowing the harvester to gather the precious seed heads. The tool is so diagnostic of this activity that archaeologists have a specific marker to look for: a lustrous, glossy sheen that develops on the flint's edge from the friction of repeatedly cutting the silica-rich stems of grasses. The presence of this sickle sheen at a site is an unmistakable sign that a community had made the full leap to agriculture. The harvest, however, was only the beginning of the work. The hard, almost inedible kernels of grain now had to be processed into flour, and this required the third key piece of the toolkit: the grinding stones. The most common form throughout the Neolithic was the saddlequern, so called because the large, stationary base stone would, over time, wear into a concave, saddle-like shape. To use it, a person, almost always a woman, would kneel before the quern, holding a smaller, loaf-shaped handstone, or rubber. For hours every single day, she would rock back and forth, using the weight of her body to grind the hard kernels between the two stones, slowly transforming them into the coarse flour that was the basis of their daily bread. This relentless daily grind has left its own poignant story in the bones of the people who performed it. Skeletal remains of Neolithic women often show a specific and telling pattern of wear and tear. They developed a distinctive form of arthritis in their knees and in the joints of their big toes, a result of the pressure of kneeling in the same position for hours on end. Their spines and arm joints also show signs of immense strain. The saddle quern was an indispensable tool, the piece of household equipment that turned the raw harvest into food. But it came at a tremendous physical cost. It is a powerful reminder that the agricultural life, for all its securities, was a life of intense and often grueling labor. These three tools, the axe to clear the land, the sickle to reap the harvest, and the quern to process the grain, formed the essential trinity of the Neolithic farming life. They were accompanied, of course, by simpler but no less vital implements like the fire-hardened digging stick, the ancestor of the hoe, used to break the soil and plant the seeds. The fact that these same fundamental solutions appeared in such disparate and unconnected parts of the world is a testament to a universal human logic. The challenges of a farming life were universal, and so too were the tools that humans invented to meet them. These humble objects, found in the remains of ancient villages the world over, may not be as spectacular as a great stone temple, but they were the true engines of the Neolithic Age, the tools that literally built the modern world from the ground up. The story of the Neolithic is often told through its most durable creations. We see it in the hard, baked earth of the first ceramic pots, and in the tough, polished stone of the axes that cleared the forests. We feel its weight in the great, silent megaliths that stand sentinel over the landscape. But parallel to this revolution in hard technologies, another, much quieter revolution was taking place, one that is far more difficult for archaeologists to see. This was a revolution in soft technology, a story of fiber and thread, of the patient, rhythmic work that transformed the fluff of a plant and the fleece of an animal into a new material that would protect, comfort, and define humanity. This was the invention of textiles. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had clothed themselves in the materials provided by the hunt, animal hides and furs. These were effective, providing warmth and protection, but they had their limits. Leather is heavy, it does not breathe well, and the process of scraping, curing, and softening it is long and laborious. In the warmer, wetter world of the Holocene, the heavy furs of the Ice Age were often impractical. A new solution was needed, and the answer lay in the new world of domesticated plants and animals. The first of the great Neolithic fibers was flax. This slender, blue-flowering plant was one of the earliest domesticates in the Fertile Crescent, cultivated alongside the first grains. While its seeds, linseed, were a valuable source of oil, its primary importance lay in the long, strong bast fibers found within its woody stem. The second great fiber was wool. This was a true innovation, a secondary product of animal domestication. The first domesticated sheep were not the fluffy, woolly creatures we know today. They were hairy, more like goats, shedding their coats annually. It took many centuries, perhaps millennia, of patient selective breeding by the first shepherds to encourage the growth of the sheep's soft, continuously growing undercoat and create the first true wool-bearing breeds. This act of genetic modification was a breakthrough, creating a fiber that was warm, elastic, and easily dyed. The journey from a raw flax stem or a greasy fleece to a finished piece of cloth was one of the most complex and labor-intensive technological processes of the ancient world. For flax, the harvested stalks first had to be retted, a process of soaking them in water for weeks to allow bacteria to break down the woody parts of the stem. They were then scutched or beaten with a wooden paddle to break away the retted pulp, and finally hackled, combed through a bed of nails to separate the long, fine fibers from the shorter, coarser ones. For wool, the fleece had to be sheared from the sheep using sharp flint knives, then painstakingly cleaned of dirt, grease, and vegetable matter. The cleaned fibers were then carded, teased between two paddles to align them in preparation for the next, most magical step. This step was spinning, the process of twisting the short, loose fibers into a single, strong, continuous thread. This was made possible by the invention of one of the most important and ubiquitous tools of the Neolithic world, the spindle and whirl. A spindle is a simple, straight stick, tapered at both ends. A whirl is a small, disc-shaped weight made of fired clay, stone, or bone, with a hole in the middle. The whirl is fitted onto the spindle, where it acts as a flywheel, maintaining the tool's momentum. The spinner would draw out a small number of prepared fibers, twist them together with their fingers to start the thread, and then give the weighted spindle a sharp twist, letting it drop and spin in the air. This spinning motion would twist the fibers tightly together, creating a strong, uniform yarn. It was an act that required immense skill and practice, and it was fantastically time-consuming. It is estimated that it could take as many as 10 hours of spinning to produce enough thread to weave just 1 square foot of cloth. The small, durable spindle whirls are found in their thousands at Neolithic sites across the world, the silent ghost evidence of this constant, essential, and near invisible labor, likely performed by women as they went about their other daily tasks. Once enough thread had been spun, it was ready for the final stage, weaving. This was done on a loom. The most common type in Neolithic Europe was the warp-weighted loom. This consisted of a simple wooden frame that leaned against a wall. A series of vertical threads, the warp, was stretched across this frame. To keep them taut, the weavers would tie them in bunches at the bottom to heavy weights made of baked clay or stone. The weaver would then pass a second thread, the weft, back and forth horizontally, over and under the taut warp threads, using a weaving comb or beater to pack each new line of weft down tightly, slowly, and methodically, creating the fabric. This new material, cloth, transformed Neolithic life. Lightweight, breathable linen was perfectly suited to warmer climates, while wool offered unparalleled insulation against the cold and damp. Clothing became more comfortable, more flexible, and more versatile. But textiles were used for much more than just clothing. They were made into bags for carrying goods, sails to catch the wind and propel the first boats, strong ropes and fishing nets, and warm blankets for the stone beds of Skara Brae. And like pottery, cloth also became a new canvas for expression. Fibers could be dyed with colors from plants and minerals and woven into intricate patterns, allowing people to express their personal identity, their clan affiliation, or their social status. Because textiles are organic, they almost never survive in the archaeological record. It is only in rare, oxygen-free environments, like the waterlogged mud of the alpine lake dwellings or the arid conditions of desert caves, that we find actual fragile fragments of these ancient fabrics. More often, all we are left with are the durable little tools of their production. The countless spindle whorls and clay loom weights. These humble artifacts are the clues that allow us to imagine a world filled with the soft hum of the spinning spindle and the rhythmic clack of the loom, the quiet sounds of a revolution that clothed the new world, one thread at a time. The soft, newly woven fabrics of the Neolithic Age clothed the world that was changing at a dizzying pace. The hum of the spindle and the clack of the loom were the soundtrack to a domestic life that was becoming ever more settled, secure, and technologically complex. But this new life, built upon the foundation of the farmer's field and the shepherd's flock, did not just transform the landscape, the home, and the toolkit. It reached deep inside the people themselves, fundamentally changing their bodies, their health, and their relationship with disease. For many years, the agricultural revolution was seen as a great leap forward for humanity in every respect. But the story written in the bones of these first farmers tells a much more complex and startling tale. It asks a profound question: was this new way of life actually good for us? To understand the impact of the Neolithic diet, we must first look at the health of the people who came before. The skeletons of our Paleolithic and Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestors paint a picture of a life that was, in many ways, surprisingly robust. Their diet was incredibly diverse and nutritious. It was rich in lean animal protein and healthy fats from a wide variety of game and fish. It was also high in fiber, vitamins, and minerals from a constantly changing menu of wild nuts, seeds, fruits, leaves, and tubers. While they certainly faced the constant threats of injury, predation, and periodic starvation if a hunt failed, their bodies were generally strong and tall. Their teeth, in particular, were almost perfect, showing very few signs of the cavities and gum disease that plague us today. Then came agriculture, and with it, a dietary revolution. The sheer variety of the foragers' menu was replaced by a heavy reliance on a small number of staple crops. Whether it was wheat and barley in the West, rice and millet in the East, or maize in the Americas, the new diet was dominated by carbohydrates. While farming provided a much more reliable and storable supply of calories, dramatically reducing the risk of catastrophic famine, this reliability came at the cost of nutritional quality. The new diet was often deficient in essential proteins, vitamins, and minerals. This profound shift left its mark directly on the skeletons of the people who adopted it, a field of study known as paleopathology. The first and most obvious change was a decrease in average height. In almost every region of the world where the transition to agriculture has been studied, the skeletons of the first farmers are consistently shorter than those of their hunter-gatherer predecessors. This loss of stature is a classic indicator of malnutrition and physiological stress, particularly during the crucial growth years of childhood. An even more dramatic story is told by their teeth. The soft, starchy, and carb-heavy food of the farmers was a disaster for dental health. While hunter-gatherers gnawed on tough, fibrous foods that naturally clean their teeth, farmers were eating soft porridges and breads that stuck to the enamel, creating a perfect environment for bacteria. The result was an explosion of dental caries, or cavities. Skeletons from this period show a massive increase in tooth decay, painful abscesses, and widespread tooth loss, problems that were almost non-existent in the Paleolithic. For many Neolithic people, life would have been accompanied by the chronic, debilitating pain of a constant toothache. The bones also reveal widespread iron deficiency anemia. Archaeologists can see this in the form of two specific conditions: porotic hyperostosis, which gives the flat bones of the skull a spongy or porous appearance, and cribra orbitalia, a similar pitting that appears on the bone inside the eye sockets. This anemia was likely caused by a double bind. Not only was the new grain-based diet often lower in usable iron, but some staples, like maize, actually contain compounds that inhibit the body's ability to absorb what little iron is present. This nutritional stress was compounded by a whole new world of disease. Hunter-gatherers lived in small, mobile bands, constantly moving away from their own waste and keeping their population density low. The new permanent villages of the Neolithic were a different story. Larger populations living in close quarters, surrounded by their rubbish pits and the waste of their animals, created the perfect breeding ground for parasites and infectious diseases. And the new, intimate relationship with domestic animals created a pathway for a host of deadly new pathogens to make the jump to humans. Most of the great epidemic diseases of history have their origins in the Neolithic farmyard. Tuberculosis and smallpox likely evolved from a disease of cattle. Measles is closely related to the rinderpest virus, also from cattle. The flu has its origins in the pigs and waterfowl with which farmers shared their environment. These diseases of civilization were born in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the first farming villages. This brings us to the great Neolithic paradox. If the agricultural life made people shorter, sicker, and gave them terrible teeth, why did it succeed so spectacularly, spreading to conquer almost the entire globe? The answer, it seems, has little to do with improved health and everything to do with fertility. The key was the availability of soft, high-carbohydrate baby food. The new porridges and gruels allowed farming mothers to wean their infants much earlier than was possible for foraging mothers, who might have to breastfeed for several years. Earlier, weaning dramatically shortens the natural period of infertility that accompanies breastfeeding. This meant that farming women could have more children, spaced more closely together. Even if individual health declined and child mortality was high, the overall population growth rate of farming communities was far higher than that of hunter-gatherers. Agriculture was, in essence, an incredibly successful reproductive strategy. It was a system that was brilliant at producing more calories, which in turn produced more people. And in the long game of history, sheer numbers are a powerful advantage. The shift to agriculture brought with it a profound biological trade-off. While the species Homo sapiens flourished, growing in numbers as never before, the health of the individual often declined. Life in the first farming villages was a paradox of collective success and individual precarity, a world of greater food security, but also of new diseases, chronic malnutrition, and relentless labor. This new, settled, and often stressful existence demanded new ways of making sense of the world. It created a fertile ground for the growth of more elaborate and deeply felt religious beliefs. The old spirits of the hunt and the wandering life were no longer sufficient. The farmers needed a new spiritual toolkit to navigate the new forces that now governed their lives. The mysterious fertility of the soil, the cyclical promise of the harvest, the terrifying unpredictability of drought and disease, and the constant presence of death in a now crowded community. At the very heart of this new spiritual world was a powerful and pervasive focus on the cult of the ancestors. For nomadic hunter-gatherers, ancestors were a matter of memory and story. But for settled farmers, they became a physical and spiritual anchor to a specific place. The act of burying the dead within the community's territory, and even more intimately, beneath the floors of the very houses where the living slept, was a way of cementing a permanent bond with the land. The ancestors were the original title deed, their presence in the soil a sacred and undeniable claim to ownership. They were the roots of the community, and to abandon the land would be to abandon the dead. The most dramatic physical evidence for this belief comes from the early farming villages of the Levant, during the period known as the pre-pottery Neolithic Age. Here, people practiced a remarkable and intimate ritual with their dead. After an individual died and their body had decomposed, family members would carefully retrieve the skull. They would often remove the lower jaw, and then, using a delicate plaster made from burnt limestone, they would remodel the features of the deceased directly onto the bone. The face was recreated, the nose and ears sculpted, and the empty eye sockets were often inlaid with cowrie shells, giving the skull a serene, wide-eyed stare. These were not generic representations. They were clearly intended to be hauntingly personal portraits of specific, beloved, and powerful family members. These plastered skulls were not then reburied. They were kept and displayed within the home, perhaps brought out for specific ceremonies or consulted for their wisdom. They were a tangible way of keeping the presence, the power, and the identity of the ancestors active within the world of the living. They were the intermediaries, the conduits through which the family could appeal to the spirit world, the silent, watchful guardians of the household. Flowing alongside this deep reverence for the human ancestors was an equally powerful focus on the great forces of fertility and the earth. The entire agricultural enterprise was a gamble on the continued fertility of the land, the animals, and the people themselves. This anxiety and hope found expression in the thousands of figurines found at Neolithic sites across the Old World. For a long time, the prevalence of female figures, many depicted with exaggerated hips and breasts, sometimes in the act of giving birth, led to the theory of a single, universal, mother goddess religion, a belief in a great Earth Mother who governed all life. While this is a powerful idea, many archaeologists now see a more complex picture. The artistic world of the Neolithic was also filled with male figures, with androgynous beings, and with powerful animal symbols. The great wild bull, or aurochs, was a particularly common and potent symbol. Its massive horns and untamable strength representing the wild, masculine, and fertile power of nature. It is perhaps more accurate to say that Neolithic people were focused not on a single deity, but on the great, intertwined cycle of life, death, and regeneration. A cycle they saw played out every year in their fields, from the planting of the seed in the earth to the emergence of the new grain. Finally, if the ancestors represented the power of the world below, and fertility represented the power of the world around them, then the great stone monuments point to a deep reverence for the cosmos and the sky above. As we saw at Stonehenge, these structures were often precisely aligned with the movements of the sun. At the even older Great Passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, a colossal mound built around 3200 BC, this connection is made with breathtaking precision. For just a few days around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the first rays of the rising sun shine through a special opening above the tomb's entrance, sending a narrow beam of golden light down a 60-foot-long stone passage to illuminate the central burial chamber at the heart of the mound. For a farming community, this was not just a beautiful spectacle. It was a matter of survival. The sun was the source of all life and warmth, and its annual cycle dictated the rhythm of their entire existence. Tracking the solstices and equinoxes was essential for knowing when to plant and when to harvest. These great monuments were sacred calendars, places where the community could gather to participate in the great cosmic drama, performing the rituals that would ensure the sun would return from its winter death, that the days would grow long again, and that the cycle of life would continue. The spiritual universe of the Neolithic farmer, then, was a three-tiered one. It was rooted in the earth and the ancestors below. It was lived out in the domestic world of the village, and it was governed by the great cyclical powers of the sky. Their religion was the essential practice that bound these worlds together, a rich and varied tapestry of belief that gave meaning to their new, settled life and provided a sense of order and hope in a world that was, as ever, full of uncertainty. The Neolithic world, with its deep reverence for the ancestors, the earth, and the cosmos, had created a stable and deeply meaningful social order. For thousands of years, its peoples had built their lives and their beliefs around a familiar and reliable set of materials: the wood of the forests, the bones of their animals, the clay of the riverbanks, and the enduring stone of the earth. But towards the end of this long era, in the workshops and kilns of its most advanced societies, a new kind of material was being discovered. It was a substance unlike any other they had ever known, not chipped into shape like flint, not molded like clay, but a strange, heavy, glittering stone that could be beaten into new forms, and with the application of intense heat, could be made to melt and flow like water. This was the discovery of metal, and its gleaming arrival marks the long, slow dawn of a new age. The story of metallurgy begins with copper. At first, people would have encountered it in its pure or native form. In a few rare places, nuggets of pure copper could be found lying on the ground or in rock fissures. These early metalworkers would have treated it like a strange, soft, and remarkably beautiful kind of stone. They found that, unlike flint, it didn't shatter when struck, but could be hammered and bent into shape, a property we call malleability. The first copper artifacts were likely small, personal ornaments, beads, pendants, and pins, laboriously hammered into shape in a process called cold working. Through this work, they would have quickly discovered a key property of the metal. As copper is hammered, it becomes harder and more brittle, a process called work hardening. Eventually, it will crack. The first great metallurgical breakthrough was the discovery of annealing. By accident or by experiment, a smith would have learned that heating a piece of brittle, work-hardened copper in a fire and allowing it to cool slowly would miraculously restore its softness and malleability. This simple process of heating and cooling allowed for the creation of much more complex and delicate objects than was possible with cold working alone. But the true revolution, the one that would ultimately end the Stone Age, was the invention of smelting. This was the discovery that copper could be extracted from the colorful stone-like ores in which it is usually found, such as the green malachite or the blue azurite. As we saw with the brilliant Vincher culture in the Balkans, the world's first true metallurgists appeared in southeastern Europe as early as 5000 BC. Smelting was a far more complex and magical process than annealing. It required the invention of a new technology, a kiln or furnace, likely built of clay, that could reach the incredibly high temperature of 1085 degrees Celsius, 1985 degrees Fahrenheit, the melting point of copper. Inside this inferno, the ore would break down and the molten glowing copper would separate from the rocky waste or slag. Once they could produce liquid metal, they could move beyond simply hammering it. They could now pour it into molds carved from stone or shaped from clay, a process called casting. This allowed them to produce standardized tools and weapons, such as axe heads and daggers, in a way that was completely impossible with stone. A broken copper axe, unlike a broken stone one, was not useless. It could simply be melted down and recast, making metal an eternally recyclable material. The arrival of this new technology had profound social consequences that rippled through the late Neolithic world. Metallurgy was not a skill that everyone possessed. It required deep, specialized knowledge, knowing where to find the right ores, how to build a furnace that could reach the required temperature, and how to control the almost magical transformation of rock into metal. The smith, the first full-time craft specialist, became a new and powerful figure in society, a guardian of secret knowledge, whose work was likely shrouded in ritual and magic. Furthermore, copper was, at first, incredibly rare and difficult to produce. This meant that the first metal objects were not everyday utilitarian tools. For felling a tree, a well-made polished stone axe was still cheaper, more common, and in many ways, more effective. Instead, copper was used to create what we call prestige goods. These were shiny, beautiful objects, daggers that would never rust, elaborate pins to fasten cloaks, and glittering ornaments, whose primary purpose was to signify the wealth and status of their owner. In a world that had, for thousands of years, been largely egalitarian, this new, rare material provided a powerful way for an emerging elite of chiefs and warriors to visibly distinguish themselves from the rest of their community. The gleam of copper was the gleam of social inequality beginning to take hold. This period, known as the Chalcolithic or Copperstone Age, was an age of transition. For the vast majority of people, stone remained the dominant material for the tools of daily life. But the presence of copper was driving change, fueling new long-distance trade routes to control the sources of the precious ore and creating new social hierarchies. This was also a time of other profound innovations. It was during this late Neolithic period that people began to discover the secondary products of their livestock. They learned to use their animals not just for their meat, but for renewable resources, for the milk of their cattle and goats, for the wool of their newly bred sheep, and for their power as they harnessed the first oxen to pull a simple plow or ard through their fields. This combination of new technologies, metallurgy, and the plow was creating a world that was becoming richer, more productive, and more complex, but also more divided. The Chalcolithic was the final glittering chapter of the Neolithic Age. The discovery of copper had opened a door, and humanity was now looking through it into a new metallic future. The next step, the discovery that mixing a little tin with the copper could create bronze, a hard and durable alloy, perfect for tools and weapons, would formally usher in the Bronze Age. But the long, slow dawn of that new era began here, with the first smiths who coaxed a glowing liquid sun from a common green stone. The first glimmer of copper, coaxed from its stone-like ore by the transformative power of fire, marks the symbolic end of the new Stone Age. This new, magical material, which could be melted and reborn into any shape, was a harbinger of the future, a bridge to the coming ages of bronze and iron. Its arrival closes a vast and foundational chapter of the human story, a period of some 10,000 years that had completely remade humanity and the planet. We have journeyed from the end of the last ice age to this Chalcolithic dawn, and now it is time to look back from the threshold of this new era and ask the most fundamental question of all. What was the ultimate legacy of this great revolution? Was the invention of agriculture, the very foundation of our modern world, a great leap forward for humanity? Or was it, as some have claimed, the worst mistake in the history of our species? The case against the agricultural revolution is a sobering one. As we have seen, the story written in the bones of the first farmers is not one of straightforward progress. On average, they were shorter and less well-nourished than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their teeth, ravaged by a new diet of soft, starchy carbohydrates, were riddled with cavities and painful abscesses. They lived in larger, more crowded villages, which, combined with their close proximity to their domestic animals, created the perfect breeding ground for devastating new epidemic diseases. Their lives were also filled with a new kind of relentless, back-breaking labor. The varied and often leisurely pursuits of the forager were replaced by the monotonous, seasonal grind of clearing fields, tilling soil, sowing seeds, weeding, and the exhausting daily work of processing the harvest. Socially, the revolution created the very concepts of property and surplus that for the first time allowed for the rise of permanent inequality. The shared resources of the foraging band gave way to the farmer's field and the chief's granary. The egalitarian world of the early Neolithic, as seen at sites like Skara Brae, eventually gave way to societies with powerful elites, priests, and warriors who lived off the labor of the peasant masses. It was a revolution that, in many ways, chained humanity to the soil and to a new set of masters. It was a trap, one that was entered into slowly, with each small, seemingly logical step making it harder to turn back, until the old world was gone forever. And yet, without this mistake, almost nothing that we define as civilization would exist. The food surplus created by agriculture, for all its costs, was the essential precondition for everything that followed. It was the stored energy that allowed for the growth of cities, the specialization of labor, and the development of writing, of science, of monumental art and architecture. Every book ever written, every symphony ever composed, every scientific discovery ever made is a downstream consequence of the fact that a small number of farmers could produce enough food to feed the poets, the musicians, and the thinkers. The leisure to contemplate the stars or to develop a system of laws is a luxury bought and paid for by the sweat of the Neolithic farmer. From a purely evolutionary perspective, the agricultural revolution was an unprecedented success. It was a strategy that allowed our species to multiply its numbers at a dizzying rate, from perhaps a few million people scattered across the globe at the end of the Ice Age to the nearly 8 billion who inhabit it today. And perhaps it was never truly a choice. In a world of changing climate and growing populations, the old hunter-gatherer lifestyle was becoming increasingly untenable in many regions. Agriculture was not adopted because it offered a better life, but because for many, it was the only viable path away from starvation. The legacy of this ancient revolution is not something we can simply observe from a distance. It is written into our modern lives, into our societies, and into our very bodies. Our own biological systems are, in many ways, still those of our Paleolithic ancestors, now struggling to cope with a Neolithic diet that has been supercharged by industrial processing. The modern epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease are the long-term consequences of our bodies being flooded with the cheap, abundant sugars and carbohydrates that our Neolithic ancestors worked so tirelessly to cultivate. Our social worlds, our concepts of property, of inheritance, of national borders, which are, in essence, the territorial lines of great farming communities, writ large, all have their deepest roots in the soil of the first fields. So was it a mistake? Perhaps that is the wrong question to ask. It was not a mistake, nor was it a simple triumph. It was an entanglement. Humans domesticated the wheat, but in a very real sense, the wheat also domesticated us, forcing us to settle down, to tend to its needs, to structure our lives around its seasons. We became dependent on our crops and our herds, and they became completely dependent on us. It was a grand, irreversible bargain with nature, a co-evolutionary pact that we are still living with today. Our long journey through the new Stone Age is now at its end. We have seen our ancestors remake their world with stone, with bone, with clay, and with the first glimmer of shining copper. The story they left behind, a timeless tale of human ingenuity, labor, belief, and the deep enduring quest for a more secure life, is the foundation of our own. And now, as the fire in the hearth of that last Neolithic village burns down to embers, may the whispers of this deep past guide you into a quiet and deeply restful sleep.